Good morning. Woo. Blowing myself off the stage here. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here on time. Our first guests who are arriving momentarily, our esteemed legislators, are on a tight schedule, so I really appreciate you all being here and being here on time. I want to make just a couple of announcements before we dig in. The first is that we are live streaming this event, so your quiet participation is welcomed. The second announcement I would like to make is to thank the Terner Center team who have put this together, even through home power outages and other effects. The entire UC Berkeley campus has been shut down on and off for the past 2 weeks. So I really want to give a big shout out to Cora Johnson-Grau in the back there, to Susan Anthony, our event coordinator, and to Susan Leong, who I think is out still at the registration table. These folks have done an amazing job ensuring that all of this has run smoothly. And you will meet other members of the Terner team throughout the day, so we'll save more introductions of them, but I just want to personally thank the entire Terner team for the idea of doing this convening and all the work that they've put into making this happen. And I really do need to just, I think it would be most appropriate to frankly acknowledge the challenges that many of us in this room have been having with the ongoing fires in California, but more importantly, that our thoughts are with those who are evacuating, losing their homes, and of course, the firefighters who are trying to get all of this under control. And for all of us who care about the intersection of climate change and housing policy, some of what we are going to talk about today, I think we really should be extending some of these thoughts to how we deal with creating more resilient communities moving forward. So I just want to acknowledge that. So just a couple of opening remarks here before I invite our Assembly member and senator up to the stage to have a conversation. Why are we here? We are here titled the zoning reform and what lessons can California learn from other places and from the work that we've done so far on zoning reform in California. And we've had some big wins in the California legislature, both in 2019 and in prior years. And really, big zoning reform has somewhat eluded us. And I think what we'd like to talk about is how can we take the momentum of the wins that we've had and think about how we leverage those wins for further change. So we've had big wins this year in renter protections. We've had big budget wins, more than we've had in California in generations. For affordable housing, and we've had incremental and important change around accessory dwelling units, no more moratoriums on downzoning, some important changes that have been made. And so the question is, how do we leverage the coalitions that have been built and the work that's been done to get more change to happen here moving forward? So that is why we're here. And we really have invited our friends from Portland and Oregon to hear about how they've done what they have done. And we've invited friends from a number of other cities across the country to hear their change-making stories around zoning reform. And again, I want to be clear that at the end of this, so I want you all to be thinking, we are going to sum up the insights that we as a Terner team have from the conversations that we're going to hear today. And we're also going to invite over lunch at each table to have conversations about your further thoughts on how we can move the dial. And we will be summarizing all of this in our own research and thoughts about these issues when all of this is over. So really appreciate your thoughtfulness in your Q&A during these panels, and hopefully you will stay and engage in that conversation over lunch. All right? So again, our goals today are to learn from all that we have accomplished so far, and how can we extend that work moving forward. And so with that, I am going to invite up our guests. Is Assemblymember Chu actually here? 3 more minutes. 3 more minutes. Okay. Well, thank you, Senator Wiener, for being on time. Well, we will. There he is. Great. Whoa. Talk about being right on cue. So if you are ready, I'm going to ask, I'll introduce them both as they get their mics on and come on up here. So first, Assemblymember David Chu, who just walked in, is the son of first-generation immigrants. Assemblymember Chu previously served as a civil rights attorney, a criminal prosecutor, affordable housing nonprofit board chair, and of course was on the San Francisco president of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. He is currently the chair of the Assembly Housing Committee and has done momentous work on moving housing legislation in California. And joining him in the esteemed legislature in 2016 is Senator Scott Wiener. Senator Wiener represents District 11 in San Francisco in the state Senate, and he is an incredible housing policy wonk. Actually, they both are. They can geek out with the best of you on all of these topics. And Senator Wiener chairs the Housing Committee of the State Senate. So these two folks are really the driving force behind changes in the legislature around housing, zoning issues in California, and we couldn't be more well represented with these two gentlemen at the head. So with that, if I could ask you both to come on up here, we're going to have a short conversation about where we go from here. Good morning to you both.
Morning.
Assemblymember Chu, do you need some coffee, or are you all right there?
I'm good, and I just apologize. It was because we don't have enough housing near transit that it took me 45 minutes to travel about 7 miles, but here I am.
I was actually late too, just not as late and it was because of Muni. So it's a global problem.
Well, welcome to San Francisco. This is our challenge. So let me start off. I have a few questions I want to ask each of you. We only have about 30 minutes, so think about that as you answer each question so I can make sure I get to all of them. But I'd like you to reflect on the 2019 session in the legislature. Obviously, as I mentioned, we made real progress on accessory dwelling units, on renter protections was a big deal in California. But to truly alleviate our housing crisis, I know you both know we need to do more on the production side. Zoning reform is part of that. There are other things that are part of that. Could you each, and I'm going to start with you, Assemblymember Chu, could you reflect on how what got accomplished in 2019 might be leveraged to move us forward.
Sure. So let me start by saying the obvious, which is I think 2019 was a mixed bag. I think we started 2019 thinking and assuming we were going to have some major steps forward with production, and I know Scott, and I'll leave it to him to talk about the SB50 experience. But there were certainly some major steps that we took forward in a number of other realms, as Carol just alluded to. First, around protection, and I have to really credit the Terner Center for being the heart of the early days of the conversation around what became the Tenant Protection Act. Because the Terner Center, during the Prop 10 debate of last year, was the first institution to suggest this idea of a rent cap, which became the heart of the tenant bill that we just passed, along with the idea of just cause protections. Those were two ideas that then moved through the CASA conversation and then into our bill. So on the protection front, we obviously had a tremendous victory with really the historic movement forward of protecting millions of tenants who have been run rent increase away from homelessness or eviction. But as I often say these days, this is a short-term gap. We know that it's incredibly important to stabilize the situation of folks today, but in the long term, if we're not producing millions of units of housing, that's the bane that we've got to address. I will also say another very positive development this year was with our new governor. We put in over $2 billion of new investment when it comes to housing, for affordable housing, for homelessness, for other types of development, money to cities to help them with planning, so that our hope is after this year, after next year, no city should have the excuse that they're not prepared to move things forward. And then I will mention a number of sort of smaller production things that we were able to move forward. We obviously had a number of bills in the ADU context, and I think many of us have held great hope that in-laws, accessory dwelling units will be an important place for us to move forward housing production. So I would say after this year, hopefully we will not have to deal with any number of ADU bills that we've dealt with in recent years because we've done so many. I also had a bill that the governor signed which increases density bonuses for affordable housing projects, which will make it much easier for some of those projects to pencil out, and I think could be a model for density bonus policies in other arenas when it comes to development. But we clearly, let me just end where I started, which is we've got a lot of work to do when it comes to production. And as far as next year goes, my mantra these days is 2020 in the legislature in Sacramento should be about the year of production, and that should hopefully be led by a very real and hopefully positive conversation around SB50. And now I turn it over to Scott Wiener.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I also want to thank the Terner Center for the work that you do. It's really helpful. So one of the, I think, frustrations of being in the California legislature is there is this massive institutional pressure to take baby steps, just to do a little bit here and a little bit there, and that maybe in like 10 or 15 years we'll do all the things that we need to do to solve a problem. Huge pressure to do that. One of the most common pieces of feedback, and I'm sure David hears this too, we all do, that you hear on bills is you'll get to a committee and a committee consultant or someone will say, wow, that's a really, that's an ambitious bill. There's a lot in that bill. It's like a critique of the bill, that you're trying to actually do a lot to solve a problem as opposed to one little thing. And so I'm trying to change that. In the Housing Committee, I sometimes offer authors, as chair, amendments to strengthen and broaden their bill. And when you say, hey, I'm not going to force this amendment on you, but I'm willing to put this amendment in to make your bill bigger and stronger, and people get confused. They don't know. They're used to everything has to be chopping down. And I say that just because I think we all would love to just do everything to solve everything about housing in 1 year or 2 years. That would be great, and we should keep trying to do everything we can. But the institutional pressures are so significant, not to mention all of the drama and bizarre politics around housing in California, with a whole institutionalized movement that is sort of called the fake news, fake information movement around housing, like more housing doesn't really make housing more affordable, or we should only build 100% affordable housing, even though there's no way we would ever actually build enough units in doing that, or just all sort of the fake information to try to justify not building anything. But despite all of that, the institutional pressure, the weird, bizarre politics around housing in California, it's actually sort of extraordinary what the legislature and governor have been able to accomplish in the last few years.
Right.
And if you look at ADUs and showing the shifting of the politics, you have cities that historically have fought ADUs for 30 years, including San Francisco. Fought. ADUs, oh my God, it's going to destroy everything. Who are now saying, no, we embrace ADUs. ADUs are the global solution to everything. Don't do anything else. and that, like, you know, even though they're wrong, but it's like sort of great that we've now shifted the field in that direction. So that's a good thing. Or communities that have spent 50 years fighting affordable housing for low-income people in their community because it's going to destroy everything. Now arguing, oh my God, we need only affordable housing. Now we know it's not they don't have any integrity in that argument, but they're at least making that argument. That makes it harder for them to oppose affordable housing in the future. They'll do it anyway, but you know, it makes it a little harder. So with that said, in the last few years, we have, you know, just closed so many loopholes in ADUs, as David mentioned. I mean, dramatic strengthening of the ADU laws. We have repeatedly beefed up the Housing Accountability Act so that it actually does something now, and city councils are getting memos from their attorneys saying you can do this, but you're going to get sued and have to pay attorney's fees and so on and so forth. We have a lot more streamlining to do, but we've been able to do various forms of streamlining to the point now in California, 100% affordable housing because of SB 35, which I authored, and then a bill that David authored around supportive housing. In combination, anything that's below market, up to 80% of AMI, if it's at least half subsidized, is effectively streamlined everywhere in California, with the exception of a few small cities, everywhere. And so you have affordable housing projects that can just zoom through the process, no CEQA, no conditional use, nothing. When you look at the renter protection legislation that David and also someone like Grayson is here who played a key role in that, and others, it still sort of blows my mind that law, you know, passed in the form that it passed, all in one fell swoop, to cap rents statewide, to have statewide just cause. 3 or 4 years ago, that bill would not have made it out of a single committee. It would have been dead on arrival. And it powered through this time because of strong authorship and changing political dynamics and a committed governor. So a lot happening, much bigger investments in affordable housing. And yes, we have to do zoning reform. And SB 50, you know, despite some inaccurate press reporting, not by anyone in this room, people who say, oh, SB 50 died. Well, it didn't die. It was always alive. It just got delayed into a 2-year bill, and it's going to come forward in the Senate in January. And so we're working to even strengthen our already strong coalition to make that happen.
Great. So that actually leads me right into a question, or a reflection from both of you. We did do strong tenant protections this past year. Can you talk about, you both sound hopeful that having done that will help us, kind of move forward on the production side. And I will hear more about this from the folks in Oregon, but what I understand from their experience is they really held those two things closely, the tenant protection and the upzoning, so to speak, very closely together in terms of a coalition from a process standpoint. are you confident that, you know, the coalition, the CASA, the tech equity folks, you know, all the folks who worked on the tenant protection will, you know, be there to, in equal force, to kind of promote the production orientation?
Well, I mean, yes, that was the plan, to have it all move forward together.
Right.
You know, the senator from the Pasadena area made that not happen. That's okay. That was his prerogative. So you take the hand that you're dealt. I think it complicates things, but I think we can make it happen. I think there is more renter protection work to do. In addition, I'm hopeful that we can bring back tax increment tools. I know David has a bill on that to try to work with the cities and provide a tool that cities used to have and lost. And so I think there are, you know, we have the fee, impact fee issue that some of immigration's working on. We still have a bunch of things that we can package together, I think, to have a strong housing approach next year.
So, David, do you want to talk about, you know, like, do we need some incentives, you know, to get over some of the local control concerns about, you know, their infrastructure needs or the impact of more density on their communities?
Possibly, but if I want to answer the question
Sure.
you had about the prognosis of keeping the coalition together. I'm hopeful. I think the challenge we had before the tenant bill passed was the conversation around SB 50. There were progressive equity groups that had concerns that we all know around gentrification, and the concerns that somehow folks would get pushed out of communities. And I think with the passage of the Tenant Protection Act, we are putting those concerns not completely aside, but we're saying we have taken a major step in addressing this. We have put the strongest tenant protections in the country, and now we need to look at the production conversation because as I said before, that's the long term play. Now, on your question of are there sweeteners to locals around how to do this, I think possibly. I personally think that we should be able to move with large-scale zoning reform without those sweeteners. And I think with the budget this year, we've provided an awful lot of carrots to cities to get themselves ready, as well as to do what they do. But as Scott alluded to, I think there's a possibility of tax increment financing, so-called redevelopment 2.0, being part of a broader package. I think there are some other things that we can consider for cities to help them sort of come around the bend and understand this.
So could either of you talk about, you know, is there specific amendments that you're thinking about? Is it too soon to talk about those? Are there ways of thinking about how to either mollify or navigate through this very touchy issue of local control over zoning decisions that you know, we need to talk about?
I mean, we've made many amendments to this bill over the last really year and a half, both in working with Senator McGuire, but also working with local planning departments, working with a broad equity coalition from across the state, working with environmental organizations, working with all sorts of different groups and stakeholders, again, including city planning departments. And we made direct amendments into the bill based on some local feedback. And we continue to have an open door, and I'm proud of the work that we've done, which has built just a shockingly broad coalition that I never thought would be this broad. We're of course going to continue to work, and I'm sure there will be some more amendments before January. But we also have to be clear that there are many of these local governments that, and some of the sort of no growth neighborhood groups whether in LA or San Francisco or anywhere else, that will never be mollified. They won't be mollified unless the bill is either withdrawn or unless the bill is completely neutered so it really doesn't do anything. They just don't want to have any growth in their community, and they want to continue to have a broken system where they can make stuff take 10 years and refuse to zone. So yes, we're going to, there will no doubt be some additional amendments, but a lot of these folks are never going to be anything but opposed.
Yeah. So speaking of other, challenges with the locals, there are new RENA requirements, and I think the LA area just got 1.3 million new allocation for the next RENA cycle, and there's fair housing requirements now, affecting housing elements. So how do you think those new facts will impact getting locals on board with some of the necessary zoning reform?
RENA is like, it's just hard to, it's less broken down than it was a couple years ago. We were able to pass SB 828 last year that I think has really helped in terms of, moving past, Beverly Hills getting a RENA allocation of 3, or communities.
For our friends outside of California, RENA is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation.
Yeah. Or communities that brag about, don't make me do anything because we're doing our fair share, we're meeting our RENA goals. When I look, I'm like, your RENA goal was 110 units for an 8-year period. Don't talk to me about that's not meaningful. RENA has been a complete and utter joke. And having gone through that process, it's like so painful. And then you end up with something that is sort of, it's not even a joke, it is really, it's been destructive in terms of rich communities pushing RENA allocations into low income communities that have less power, and then run around saying, well, we had 110 and we did 130, so we're doing our fair share, even though we're on top of a BART station and 15 minutes from downtown San Francisco. So we've made it better, I think, but we continue, the fact that SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, had the gall to put forward a just really small number, 400,000 units, for all of Southern California minus San Diego for an 8-year period, for something that's almost half the population of California. The fact that they had the gall to put that out, it was so brazen, shows that we still have a problem. Now, I want to thank HCD for wiping that aside and saying, no, you're 1.3 million, and more than tripling what SCAG had proposed. So that was positive. But now we just saw SCAG has put out their proposal for how they're going to sub-allocate within their region. And guess what? They're pushing a whole bunch of allocation inland, into the Inland Empire. Because guess what? The Inland Empire is not as powerful as LA County and as Orange County and as these coastal areas. So why is it that the city of Riverside has, I think if I recall correctly, 20 times the RENA allocation as Beverly Hills? All we're going to do is continue to push people into these super commutes. So I think we started to deal with the aggregate problem, but the sub-allocation problem particularly, and maybe SCAG needs to be broken up. Maybe it's not appropriate to have a regional entity that covers that broad an area. Maybe that's something to think about, but we have more work to do, and I think the governor is committed to doing that.
Do you want to respond to that?
I think this discussion is yet another example of why it's important to move large-scale reform. I know this is an audience that knows all these acronyms, the SCAGs, ABAG, GHGs, RENAs, et cetera, but most of our constituents don't understand this at all. And most of our constituents just see some sort of fight around the character of our neighborhoods, don't really get it. What is this discussion? But I agree with Scott that RENA is broken. RENA always underestimated what we need. RENA never had teeth. And we need to have a conversation as quickly as possible on how to move this forward. But part of what I was thinking when Scott mentioned BART and some of the debate around that is a few years ago, I moved forward along with my great colleague Tim Grayson in trying to have a small, what we thought of as a relatively minor conversation around BART-oriented, transit-oriented development. The idea that there are 300 acres around 26 BART stations, imagine 10 acres of surface parking lots around a couple dozen BART stations, that BART, land that BART owned, that it had been unable to develop for 45 years. And Tim and I had the audacity to suggest that maybe BART should be able to build 5-, 6-story mixed-use development. It was almost as if we had threatened to kill the firstborn of a number of city councilors as far as what the impact was. And so we pushed forward what we thought was a relatively incremental step bill and really kind of stepped into it. And I really have to give Tim Grayson, who is in the shadows over here, just huge credit because he Scott and I, we are the chair of the housing committees. We get attention and focus because of what we do. Tim is one of the unsung heroes in the legislature, really pushing this fight. But for us, what happened with that vote was, to me, the lesson was you got to go big. You have to reframe this in a significant way, a la SB 50, a la some of the things that we're talking about, a la saying, RENA has been broken, we need to fix it, to move the conversation, because the incremental approach during this emergency time, this crisis, doesn't work.
So two related questions. The BART bill, which I got to understand a lot better because I had my housing studio class last year, try to use it to propose projects on BART sites, one in Glen Park and one in Rockridge, so not easy BART sites to think about how you densify, and it was a fascinating experience. So is there some lessons from the BART bill getting done that are relevant to the broader transit orientation? Because one of the things that bill did was it basically gave all communities, I can't remember, it was 2 or 3 years to rezone those BART station sites to transit-oriented density guidelines put out by BART, which were pretty aggressive. Or those TOD guidelines would go into effect. So either you get to that target, or you get the prescriptive result. Is that something in the mix for broader zoning reform that we should be thinking about?
Well, I think the idea of cities want to do things their own way. I think I'm not in any way opposed to that, putting aside fair housing issues.
Right.
And when you're talking about a BART TOD situation, it's a limited area, right? It's the parking lots or area right around the station. We know that historically, not all cities, but many cities, if they have a choice about where they're going to go dense, they're going to do it in the lower income areas, in the areas with communities of color. It's going to stay away from the white single family upper income areas. That's just the way it works. So putting aside for the moment fair housing issues, which are very real. If there's a way to do that, then I think that can be a positive thing. However, particularly in a broader context like an SB 50, there are two complexities that come into play. One of them is CEQA, because if we say to cities, yeah, you have 2 years to rezone the bulk of your city or half of your city for more density, go at it. That's going to trigger a 10-year EIR process. That's how we do it in San Francisco. It usually takes 10 years. And other cities, unfortunately, are around the same and not much shorter. So there would have to be pretty categorical CEQA relief. In addition, we have about 500 cities in California. And let's say, I don't know, half of the cities decided they wanted to propose their own alternative. It's 250. Let's even round down and call it 200. HCD it's not a checklist, right? There would have to be a substantive review of, is this a scam? Because we know some cities will scam, and say, we're going to do our zoning in these areas that are impossible to develop or whatever. And so HCD would have to really staff up to be able to do prompt reviews of potentially hundreds of city complicated zoning plans. And we know that HCD already does not have the staffing it needs to implement current laws. And so those are the complexities. So in theory, it sounds great, but there's some challenges with actually writing a law and implementing it.
Great. So that's useful. You know, I think you could think about around transit areas, you know, to your first point. To your first point, right, you could constrain that density, like in the BART station, like, you know, within a quarter mile of transit, that is where your targets would have to be met. You know, you want to do some of it in a commercial corridor, you want to, you know, maybe there's a minimum you have to do in the single family neighborhoods. But, you know, thinking about, is there, and I'm interested in hearing more from, you know, our panelists today on, you know, how that played out in Portland or Denver, you know, places like that, like relative to how much was imposed, you know, at a higher level, and how much discretion there was at the local level to try to figure out whether there's something in there that makes sense for us to look at.
I think the one thing I will add, you know, in our BART bill, we left some flexibility to locals, but as Scott pointed out, again, it was around BART stations. I think we have to have a different conversation around carrots and sticks, and letting locals know that they have for decades been taking and eating and nibbling at a lot of carrots without accomplishing a lot. And I think we've just got to redefine what locals are going to get from the state in order to achieve the goals that we want. So I think it was important that Governor Newsom and others started a conversation about whether certain levels of state funding were going to be withheld from local jurisdictions if they were not cooperating in other ways. I have a feeling that that might be a direction that Governor Newsom may want to go to when it comes to redevelopment 2.0 and tax increment financing, telling cities you want to avail yourselves, you want some assistance on homelessness or transportation or infrastructure, you're gonna have to deliver on housing, and reframing it in a different way that is commensurate with the time we're in. We've got to do that.
So in the few minutes we have left, taking off of that comment, do you see specific action around redevelopment, around these carrots and sticks, and/or impact fees to Grayson's bills? Do you see action on these items, or are there other items that we haven't talked about, you know, that you see action being taken in conjunction with zoning reform in 2020?
Go ahead.
I do. I mean, there is tremendous support for bringing back some version of tax increment financing, right? We lost $1 billion a year that used to go to subsidize housing and infrastructure when redevelopment tools went away. I think we could easily get 2/3 votes for that proposition in the legislature today. Gavin Newsom campaigned on this when he was running for governor, but I think we've all come to the realization that these are huge, ginormous carrots. And I am now the perspective to understand, you know, I really do think that they have to be tied with zoning reform. I am excited this year led by Tim Grayson to have a real conversation around disparate impact fees around the state. We have some cities that have reasonable fees. We have a lot of cities that have 5, 10x the level of fees as others. And how do we rationalize that? I think that has to be part of the conversation. Now, these conversations will be challenging with local jurisdictions and with city managers. And we've got to, again, think of how do we change those incentives. The last thing I'll just mention is a bill that I carried this year. We were trying to start a Bay Area regional conversation around housing because this is not a one city, one county problem. This is 101 cities in the Bay Area, a 9-county problem. We propose that the region as a whole have the ability to raise revenues, and we're going to be, with the signature of Governor Newsom on AB 1487, in the next 6 months, our region will have a conversation around how can we raise regional funding for affordable housing to address this in every part of the Bay. This requires a real and deep conversation with, again, with our local jurisdictions. I think both Scott and I have probably had more conversations with local city councilors in the past year than ever. And it's probably true than any housing chair in history, because we've really had to engage at a very deep and granular level this discussion, and it's important. It's something we need to do, but we also need our local partners to understand that they have to be part of the solution, and or at least some of their intransigence has led to where we are today.
Yeah, I think there are opportunities. You know, I think when the governor proposed tying gas tax to housing production, there was a little bit of a unique circumstance because the legislature still has PTSD from SB1, from the gas tax increase. It was, you know, one of my colleagues got recalled over it. There was a ballot measure trying to repeal it. And so I think there was a real, you know, for a lot of people, they said, hey, I went out to my communities and told them, yeah, you're going to pay more gas tax, but we're going to get all this road money as a result. And so I think it put a lot of members of the legislature in a very awkward position. Have to go back and say, I take it back. You may not get it because you're not building enough housing. So I think it was a little awkward, but I think there is an opportunity for a broader conversation about having more financial incentives. Now I will say two things. First, in order for it to be effective, a financial incentive, it has to be huge, huge. It cannot be, you know, modest, because if it's modest, the rich communities will just say, fine, we'll pay for it locally, and the lower income communities will be the ones to take it because they need the money. So it has to be something that rich people will feel the pain, or the incentive will not work and do what we are intending for it to do. The second thing is we want to make sure that money that's being withheld isn't a withholding that's going to hurt poor people. Because poor people are not the ones that are showing up and spending 6 hours at the Planning Commission yelling and screaming about light and air and parking and so on and so forth. They're working two jobs, trying to, you know, get their kids fed, doing all the things that working families, lower income families have to do. So, for example, with transportation money, we should absolutely not be withholding any public transportation money. I don't care how bad an actor the city is, because that is only going to hurt low income people. So we have to be very, very surgical in terms of what funding streams are being withheld.
Great. So we are at time, but just as a last lightning round, what makes you hopeful that we are going to get all the things all these bold ideas you just outlined done in 2020?
I'm very hopeful. First of all, we know that the polling is on SB 50 and other pro-housing measures off the charts statewide in every single region, every demographic, even among homeowners. So we know that the self-selecting people who show up and yell are not representative of the broader electorate. More and more members of the legislature are, you know, get it, have been clear, are signing on to hard bills, people you wouldn't expect. And more city council members and mayors and county supervisors are publicly showing support for these policies, and at a minimum privately saying, go for it, I support what you're doing. So I think everything is shifting and we're going to be able to get some good things done.
I'll echo that. I think the constituencies are stepping forward, from young YIMBYs to seniors whose kids can't live in the area, to tech CEOs who are saying we're going to invest $1 billion because otherwise our competitive edge is going to be threatened, to public officials who are willing to take hard votes and do hard things. This is the time, and I think we've got to just all figure out how we hold hands and go super hard, super fast, get as much as we can. This is that time. This is that moment.
Well, thank you both very much, not just for being here today, but for all of your leadership. You are the reason that I feel hopeful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you both so much, and it's my pleasure now to introduce Elizabeth Kneebone, who is the research director for the Terner Center, and she will be making a few remarks to frame the balance of the day and our panel discussion. So Elizabeth, please join us.
Thank you. And thanks again to everyone here who's joining us in person and online for this conversation today. I think that opening discussion really helps underscore why zoning, land use, has garnered so much attention in the state and so much momentum for action, both here in California, but also in jurisdictions across the country. It's also a through line in a lot of the work that the Terner Center does, because as we were just discussing, let me make sure this, I swear this was working earlier. There we go. So this is a through line in a lot of the work we're doing, and it's garnering so much policy attention because while zoning isn't the silver bullet, it's not the thing that's going to solve the whole crisis, it's a fundamental piece of the puzzle. It's a foundational part of the multi-pronged strategy that's going to be required to really move the needle and address the crisis here and across the country and communities affected. The way that it works its way through our work at Terner Center is in multiple ways. First, since the Terner Center started, we've been working on issues like increasing transparency around just our understanding. Can we close the knowledge gaps on what the local landscape looks like for policy in jurisdictions across the state? We fielded a land use and housing policy survey in California in 2017 and 2018 that collected hundreds of pieces of information from cities and counties across the state on things like zoning and land use and housing policy. So we have information now on communities that are home to 70% of the state's population on what it actually looks like on the ground in different places. And with that information, we've been able to seed new research, to get experts from across the country to use that data to understand and explore the impacts of zoning policies on outcomes for communities and for people. And we're not just interested in what existing policy looks like and how it impacts our communities across the state and across the country. We've also done a lot of work in partnership with the Urban Displacement Project and members of the Fair Housing Task Force in the state to explore how potential changes like SB 50 could go to ground and really be a part of the solution, and how we'll see those impacts play out across different communities. And it's really each of these threads that spurred us to have this conversation today, to figure out what we can learn from experts who are further ahead in that process as we think about how to really effectively reform zoning in the state. So for instance, when we think about that land use survey and just understanding what the current landscape looks like, we learned through that, through collecting that information, that on average, less than 25% of land in the state is zoned for multifamily housing. In contrast, more than 2/3 of the jurisdictions that answered this survey dedicate most of their land for single family. That's one way, that's just one policy that can restrict productions. It's not the only one. There are others that we explore in this survey and have information on, like how communities might create large lot size requirements, or restrict height and density, or leverage onerous parking requirements. These types of things together can create really restrictive regimes that constrain production. And there are lots of ways that cities shape and affect how much gets built, what kinds of housing gets built in their communities. I'm highlighting these four because they emerge time and again throughout our working paper series. The research that we've seen and the experts across the country have been able to do with this data time and again point to these as being really consequential, as being significant to affecting a lot of key impacts on communities and people throughout the state. So in working papers like the ones done by Sarah Mahorter, who fielded the survey when she was with the Terner Center, is now at USC. Papers done by Cecile Murray and Jenny Schutz at University of Chicago and Brookings, respectively. Jonathan Rothwell, the principal economist at Gallup, Their research really helps bring to light the evidence around the ways in which these local policies matter. For one, they point out that when you have those types of restrictive policies in place, we do see constraints on production in terms of what's being built overall, total permitting, but what kind of housing is being built as well. Those constraints lead to real impacts and implications for prices. They really help to exacerbate the price pressures facing communities across the state. And Jonathan has pointed out in his paper the way that those constraints and these restrictive policies have relationships to patterns of exclusion. So communities with more restrictive regimes that use those more restrictive zoning policies are less likely to have African American and Latinx residents, to have blue collars workers represented. Those communities are underrepresented in places that have these restrictive policies compared to similar jurisdictions that have more progressive zoning. And Sarah Mahorter has found that these housing shortfalls and the price pressures that relate to them are also having impacts on young households. That when we see the number of young adults who are able to form their own households or actually buy home ownership, those rates have dropped appreciably just in 5 years. So we can see the way that these restrictive policies together have real and often negative consequences for communities and for people. But we also understand that on the flip side, pulling these levers in different ways can be part of a more productive solution. It can be part of solving the crisis. But I think what we really learned through our experience in digging deep on the tracking SB 50 it's evolved and other local policies seeking to reform the zoning ordinances, we understand that how you go about that reform really makes a difference. And that the impact that you can have is dependent on a number of different factors. So for instance, how we target the scope of this reform will matter. So we talked about those four kind of key levers, like density, single-family zoning, parking. Those sit within a broader context of a number of different policies that localities use to shape housing or potentially restrict development. So we have to sort of do some level setting and understanding about if we move these levers, exactly how much impact can these realistically produce? And how do we align them effectively in the midst of these broader landscape of policies at the local level? Likewise, the way that you set definitions matters. How are we scoping the communities that are being targeted, right? If we set definitions for communities that will be subject to reform or not, that will affect the level of impact that we can expect to see. And likewise, the communities that are targeted, they have different built environments. Their existing landscape looks different. So what is the availability and configuration of land that can be built on and developed with these reforms in mind? And finally, even if you get all of those pieces right, they still exist in variable local market conditions. As we keep saying, you know, zoning is a key piece of this puzzle, but it's only one piece. And even if you get the zoning right, it doesn't by itself produce new supply. It really has to be done in consideration, or at least as we think about what impact we can get, we have to be realistic about what local market conditions can actually deliver. And together, as we think about all these complex moving pieces on the technical component side, I think our work in this space has also really helped put a point on some process questions as well. They're the technical pieces of it, but also how it's done makes a difference for the impact and the sort of effectiveness that we might expect from these types of reforms. So as we're really thinking about how do we answer this question about using zoning reform as effectively as possible to spur production without exacerbating displacement, there are key pieces to that process. One, in coming up with the technical components, as we heard about, that coalition building is important. How are we bringing stakeholders to the table, especially in sensitive or vulnerable communities, to understand how these technical pieces come to the fore? But then once we have those technical pieces in place, I think we also have to ask ourselves, again, understanding that zoning is happening in a broader landscape, how do we integrate these reforms effectively with all of the other pieces and incremental increases or steps forward that we've seen across the state? We've talked many times already this morning about the ADU bills that we've been able to pass. So we think about the density bonus changes that have been made, the new money on the table for local capacity, and planning around these issues. How do we make sure that all of this is integrated in a way that effectively moves forward together without duplicating or creating additional capacity constraints for local communities? And we also have to think about this in the displacement and gentrification concerns. A lot of those aren't things that are going to be dealt with explicitly through the zoning code. To be able to think about those effectively, we have to go take a bigger picture, a broader look at the landscape of policies and programs that integrate together with those zoning changes. So how can we think about the process of how we pull that all together and sync that up for the biggest impact and greatest effect? And finally, that local capacity piece is so important. How do we ensure that the localities who are going to be implementing these changes are able to do so effectively, and that we leave some capacity and understanding and appetite for iteration? I think we'll be hearing later today, again, that not all of this happens in one fell swoop. There might be additional iteration or additional passes that need to be taken to make sure that we get this right and use it to greatest effect. But that, again, is why we are here today and why we're so thankful and appreciative of the experts who are joining us to share their experiences. You'll see at your table that there's a matrix of the different changes that have been implemented in the communities that are represented here today. I'm not going to go into that detail, but it's there for you to review, and we'll be making it available online for our online audience. I think what's important is that as we think about those key levers I mentioned earlier that have such impact on outcomes for communities and for residents, things like single-family zoning, density requirements, parking requirements, you can see that each of the communities here today have grappled with those issues and have taken action on addressing them. And what we're hoping to do in these conversations is, as we are grappling with these questions in California, learn from what they have already managed to accomplish, either in passing these reforms or in the actual implementation as they've gone to ground. So I briefly want to just tee up for you today the people who will be speaking to us and sharing their experience. On the first panel, as we mentioned, we're going to be hearing from Oregon and from Portland about what they've managed to do in passing landmark zoning reform at the state level and how they're thinking about what implementation looks like in cities like Portland. So we'll be hearing from Tom Armstrong, who's a supervising planner of the city of Portland, Alan Lazo, who can give our fair housing perspective to this through his seat as executive director at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. We have Mary Kyle McCurdy, from the executive director of the Thousand Friends of Oregon, who can talk about the coalitions that have come together to pass this landmark legislation. In the second panel, we'll be hearing from cities who are a bit ahead, again, of California in this process, have actually implemented and see the effects of some of these changes on the ground. We're going to be hearing from Abe Barge, the principal planner from the city of Denver, Vince Bertoni, who's the director of planning from the city of Los Angeles, and Suzanne Schultz, the former planning director, the city of Grand Rapids. We're so thankful, again, to have their expertise today. We really encourage you to be thinking about the questions you might want to ask as these conversations are developing. You'll see that you have blank cards at your table so that you're able to write those down as those questions come to you. And we'll have a chance, once they've been able to have their conversations, for you all, we'll invite you to jump in and ask questions and again, advance this conversation as we grapple with these challenging issues. So with that, I will welcome up the first panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Liam Dillon with the Los Angeles Times. Great to be here, and we're going to have a lot of fun this morning. This past year, Oregon became the first state in the country to end single-family zoning in its metropolitan areas, and the city of Portland is working on a plan that could allow even more density than in those areas that are mandated by the state. We're going to understand how that happened, what some of the ongoing concerns may be, and what implications or lessons there may be for California. So I'm joined to my left by Mary Kyle McCurdy from 1000 Friends from Oregon, and then Tom Armstrong from the city of Portland, and then Alan Lazo from the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. So I'm going to start, I'm going to try to keep this as conversational as possible. Start broadly, who wants to explain what the State Bill HB 2001 does?
House Bill 2001 requires every city over 10,000 in population in Oregon to allow duplexes on all lots in residential areas that are zoned for single-family housing. In addition, it requires cities that are over 25,000 to also, and every city in the Portland metropolitan area, except for a few small ones, those larger cities are required to also allow triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, and townhomes somewhere in their single-family residential areas. Those housing types are subject to local regulations, but those local regulations must be only related to siting and design, and must be reasonable and not designed to thwart the development of that housing. And there are some other provisions in the law, well, including it prohibits future homeowner associations or deed restrictions from prohibiting any of those housing types. And there's some other things concerning ADUs.
So I think it's important, I want to touch on a little bit further on the fourplex provision in single-family neighborhoods, not every single parcel, right?
Areas is the word.
So what does areas mean?
So this bill will be subject to rulemaking by our state land use agency. That's about to get underway, and that term will be defined.
So maybe Tom, you can kind of weigh in on the local. Obviously, it seems like there'll be a lot of local decision making around this. How is Portland and how are other areas interpreting what that provision?
Right. So we started in on this actually before the legislation was proposed. We've been working on it since 2015. We started from a point where we allowed duplexes on corner lots in single-family zones as well as ADUs, and had a pretty good set of ADU regulations and SDC waivers for ADUs that really were generating a lot of ADU development. We wanted to look at the next iteration of that for incremental density, as well as what we were seeing in the Portland market is a lot of demolitions and one-for-one replacements with large houses. I think there's a graphic here.
Yes, we have slides.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in our single-family zone, you're allowed to build up to a 6,000 square foot home on a 5,000 square foot lot. And we were seeing homes in the 3,500 to 4,000 square foot range. And so one of the motivating factors behind the residential infill project was actually to address these one-for-one demolitions with monster house replacements. And so that was part of the way we got into this process. And in exchange for looking at that, also looking at how we can allow more ADUs, 2 ADUs on a lot, and where to allow triplexes and fourplexes.
So I want to, before we leave this kind of fourplex and single-family area question, you said this still be to define, but who has the ultimate authority over whether a jurisdiction has met the requirements of the law? Does the state have sort of veto power, or does the city say, look, yes, we have a new community, one of those lots that has that's zoned for a fourplex, we're done, we met it. Like, who's going to be the ultimate arbiter of that rule?
Our state commission, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, will ultimately adopt the rules defining that and setting the boundaries for that. And then it will be implemented locally. If a city does not adopt a conforming code to what comes out of the rulemaking, the state will have a model code in place that will have to be applied directly to every permit for a housing type that's within 2001. Our state land use program also provides the ability for individuals and organizations to appeal a local land use decision that appears to violate state law. So there's a variety of ways in which
But it
there's
sounds
a
like the
check on
state
that.
is the one ultimately.
The state will
Yeah.
approve a
Yeah.
model code as well as rules defining these terms.
So in these conversations in California, a lot of the opposition has come from sort of 2 different areas. Some from suburban communities worried about issues like community character, infrastructure, parking, things like that. And then a lot of concern from lower income communities who are fearing that adding density would lead to further gentrification and displacement. So I'm going to get to both of them, but I want to talk about the displacement question. I mean, this could extend beyond just the state bill, but to Portland too. So how prominent, first of all, was this issue in the conversations surrounding the state bill?
So the issue of displacement has been a conversation certainly in Portland, but at the state level, we had over 25 organizations supporting the bill, which included the Community Alliance of Tenants, which is our most prominent statewide tenants' rights organization, the Housing Alliance, nonprofit affordable housing providers, as well as the home builders, realtors, ARP, transit organizations. So there was a recognition, and it was very powerful to have nonprofit affordable housing providers testifying that if they can build 2, 3, or 4 units on a given lot, they can deliver that product to a lower income person that's among their client base. So it wasn't as much of an issue at the state level. I will say that earlier in the session, our legislature passed a renters' rights and a rent cap bill also. These two bills were not tied together, as it sounds like it might have been in California, but it was important for some members of our legislature that that had also passed, and for groups like the Community Alliance of Tenants to be able to support a housing production bill.
Alan, can you weigh in? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Let's see if I can get this to go backwards. I guess what I'd say is, the framing, and I think a lot of what we heard here today was really remarkably similar to so many conversations we've had in Oregon. And I think, Mary Kyle, the point you made about the tenant protections having passed in Oregon early was really important. And I think it was interesting to hear that same framework from Assemblyman Liu, that is already passed here in California. Our tenant protections passed because it actually had failed 2 years earlier. And so it was important for the legislature, I think, to tee that up early on in the session and in a sense, get it out of the way so that we could move on to these other conversations. And I'm not sure how it would have worked if they had been tied together.
Right.
And I think you're right, Mary Kyle, at the state level, I don't know that there was as much concern around the displacement issues because of the nature of our state, where we have a very distinct urban and rural divide. That around the state, there aren't going to be as many places like Portland where we might experience displacement issues based on this type of upzoning. So that conversation became very specific to Portland, but it was also still part of a framework, I think, that we tried to bring kind of behind the scenes. We didn't work as closely with the legislature as folks like Mary Kyle, but really talking with folks that were framing this movement about this fair housing perspective that we can bring to upzoning proposals. And really one of them that we didn't get to talk much about, I think one of the things that changed over the last couple of years is this ability for us to lead with this conversation around race. And this really started for us in Oregon and in Portland. We brought Richard Rothstein, the author of Color of Law, one of your colleagues at the Haas Institute here, to talk about that work, and it really helped spur some of these conversations around what the benefits are when we look at upzoning and ending what had been these exclusionary practices.
Just for clarification, you guys can correct if I'm wrong, but the Oregon statewide renter legislation is a cap on rent increases of 7% plus inflation annually, perpetually. That compares to California, which passed, which is 5%, so tighter plus inflation annually, but there's a decade sunset here in California that doesn't exist in Oregon. So was there concern among groups that you're allied with at the state level about this displacement gentrification as the bill was going through?
No, it was interesting. I had conversations with a couple of folks that were in the coalition and who called me and said, I heard you have concerns about displacement issues. I said, that's not how I would frame it. I think my framing is a yes and framing. Yes, we want to do this, increase the opportunity for housing in all areas, and make sure that we aren't displacing and further harming those communities. And again, I think that for those community groups, weighing the benefits that might come by increasing opportunities, increasing affordability outweighed the potential for displacement issues in lots of places. So I think that's how the conversation went, but I think the opportunity to bring that conversation forward was what was important, and to really raise that, the other pieces that are on my slide that kind of came forward. The other thing I brought forward was for us to really seek intended outcomes. That if we are going to start with a conversation about this history of exclusion, this history of race in planning and zoning, that our outcomes from what we're intending to do ought to match. That we ought to make sure that what we're doing is serving those communities And I'm not sure that we always do that in pieces of legislation. The legislation tends to be fairly broad and doesn't always hit the mark. So the framework I've brought forward is that we ought to stop accepting unintended consequences and be very intentional about what our outcomes are going to be as we move these measures forward.
So how do we get those outcomes to be what you want them to be, particularly when, as we've heard, like the state legislation is kind of purposefully vague on a very big question, right?
Well, the nice thing is that we have 3 hours together to figure that out. So, and again, the thing that was so heartening about this morning is that the conversation is so similar here as it is in Oregon and other places. We do have to look at, it isn't just the zoning piece. There are much broader solutions that we need to look at, not just tenant protections, but the full suite of anti-displacement pieces. I think when Tom talks further about Portland, we can talk about that. And one of the things I've added to the presentation as I've started to talk about this is recognizing that carrots don't work if you're not hungry, that we are starting to see cities, of course, that we're hanging out all those carrots to them, but if it's a community, I don't know, Beverly Hills, I suppose, it seems easy to understand, it's never going to accept the incentives that we bring forward to them because they just don't have a desire to do it. And maybe I'm speaking out of turn around Beverly Hills, but we certainly have communities like that in Oregon. And so we have to find a different way to, and I'm not saying that we break out the sticks, but the incentives that we propose might not always work if there's not that underlying desire to bring inclusive communities to these places.
We could turn now a little more to the details in Portland. Maybe you can explain before we address both the displacement and other sort of community character questions there. Talk a little about what Portland has been trying to do and how that syncs with the state law.
Yeah, so in addition to limiting the size of the house, where we've evolved with our proposal is on all lots, or most lots, to be able to do to regulate the size of the box, starting at about 2,500 square feet, and incrementally go up, whether you have a house in an ADU, or 2 ADUs, or a duplex, or a triplex, or now up to a fourplex. You can incrementally grow the size of that box depending on the number of units. We are allowing that on all lots through the city except for a few that are on steep slopes and in floodplains and have sensitive natural resources on that. So we are going beyond the state legislation in that respect. And that's really been an evolution over the 4, almost 5 years that we've really worked on it, because when we started out, we were looking at close to transit centers and frequent bus stops. And I think when we got to the Planning Commission through our advisory committees, the recommendation was for triplexes on corner lots. And just over the past few years, as the housing affordability crisis has deepened in Portland, that sort of provided the momentum to expand this proposal to fourplexes on pretty much every lot in our residential zones. At the same time, we are getting a lot in terms of concern about displacement, especially when you look at local market conditions and where you think, Portland is a built-out city, so to realize a lot of this density is going to involve a demolition, and so where are land values and home prices such that you can afford to buy a house and demolish it and put up a triplex or fourplex. And those tend to be in neighborhoods with a lot of people who rent single-family homes and have higher than average shares of people of color. And so that has been the key part of the conversation to sort of push this across the finish line at City Council. And what we've done is, there is only so much you can do through the zoning code. We do have a small bonus, size bonus, if you make one of the units affordable. We're looking at taking a page out of Austin, Texas, and providing an option for an affordable sixplex in these neighborhoods. But then we've created a separate anti-displacement action plan process that the city has funded and funded community group participation to look at the other elements. We have a wheel graphic, zoning is one piece of it, tenant protections is another. 3 years ago, we passed an affordable housing bond in the city. Last year, we passed one region-wide, so we have more resources available. We've passed inclusionary housing and construction excise tax. So we are getting at that broad range of issues to try and address the displacement concerns.
And I want to pick up on one thing you responded. I believe this was in a recent article that addressed your plan as well, but some concern that because of land costs and things like that, the only place for your modeling, the only place where it's affordable to be doing these sort of tear downs or building these triplexes or fourplexes is in communities that are currently lower income, at risk of gentrification. Does that not, if like the solution is we're going to only be building there, or this process leads only to building there, or the lion's share of building there, doesn't that create its own set of problems? That where once again, kind of the richer areas of the city are excluded from a plan that was supposed to affect everybody?
Yeah, I think two aspects of that is we think of our analysis looked at Portland as sort of 3 rings around the central city. So sort of an inner ring, magic sort of 3-mile, 20-minute bus commute into the central city and the job center. That's where we've seen most of our mixed-use multifamily development over the last 10 years. We've seen the greatest price increases. I think for that respect, it's going to be really hard to buy a house, demolish it, and build a 3-plex or 4-plex. I think that's where our provisions for second ADUs come into play, and also for internal conversions. And that was a key piece of the state legislation that helps there, is a direction to our building codes division to treat triplexes and 4-plex conversions as giving the cities the local option to use a residential code instead of a commercial code for those conversions, which is a huge cost saver to be able to make those viable, especially in our older inner neighborhoods where we do have the larger historic homes that could be converted, have enough space that could be converted to 3 or 4 units. I think that the next band, sort of that 3 to 5 mile range, that's where we think the market is there. A lot of those homes are small, modest homes built post World War II. So that's where we think we will see most of this activity, because you're starting to see rents and price levels such that you can afford to redevelop. And then further out from that, East Portland is where we see our highest concentrations of low-income households. I think we're expecting less development out there because the rents aren't as high to sort of cover that new construction cost. So it is really in that middle band where I think we will be focusing a lot of our anti-displacement efforts.
Does anyone want to speak to how that's going, how that process is going, and both politically and policy-wise?
Sure. I think there's a couple pieces. I think that one Tom brought up, the slowing down of the process, I think, at this point, and reframing it as the housing opportunities, I think, has been good, especially around the anti-displacement work that has brought on from community members. But again, this is also a process that's been in play for 4 years, and we're just getting to that point now. So sequencing begins to matter as these conversations evolve. So I think it's good that we've kind of slowed down and recognized that that's a piece that needs to happen. And the process, again, has been evolving for 4 years. And even when it came to the Planning and Sustainability Commission, which is the advisory group to City Council, the vote there was 5-4. It was a very close vote, and it was really rooted in this displacement issue around, especially centered on the displacement of communities around race that have experienced displacement in Portland before. Let's see if we can get to the slide. That's maybe not quite big enough, but I'll leave it up there. So there's a lot of information in these maps. This is some of the mapping that was done as part of the displacement risk analysis for this residential infill project. And this specifically talked about the focus on communities of color. Some of those rings that you see that Tom spoke about are kind of represented there by the colors. So this particular graphic, the red areas represent where you will see the potentially higher levels of displacement burden based on the new proposal. Mm-hmm. Those also tend to represent areas that, as you can see, as Tom described those rings, those areas also tend to represent areas to which communities have been displaced from inner neighborhoods. If you want to follow the history, some neighborhoods displaced out of neighborhoods that previously had been redlined, areas that previously had exclusionary zoning are actually represented in areas that are white here, literally white on the map, and literally white in their neighborhoods. So what you see is this analysis that tells us there's a potential impact in these areas that have lower income communities and communities of color. The details of the numbers are part of the way I frame the question. So what we recognize is that the proposal overall will reduce displacement for all communities in our city. So there's a net reduction in displacement through this proposal. So that's what drives the yes and framework. Yes, it would be great for us to decrease our displacement. The question for me around an equity framework is, if we define equity in our Portland plan as sharing the burdens and benefits in our community, one of the things I recognize here is that the burden tends to fall on those communities of color, those lower income communities, more than some of the other communities, especially, again, white households that, as Tom said, the way the communities will redevelop will tend to benefit those communities more. It actually will reduce displacement more in what are currently white communities rather than the opposite. If our intention is to end this history of exclusionary zoning that had excluded opportunity for communities of color, and we aren't reaching that goal, the question is, have we met our intentions? Right? And the problem is, I'm not sure how we get there, right? I think that's what we would like to do. I don't know what the actual solution is. What you saw in Seattle was, in their housing affordability piece that moved forward, they moved forward, I think, 27 different options that were based geographically around their city. And I'm not sure there's the capacity or the ability to define it at that level.
Well, and what we've also seen here in California, I think most prominently with changes, the proposed changes to the California Environmental Quality Act for particular kinds of projects, but as it works through the legislative process, you end up basically creating an exemption that only a handful of projects can actually work with, right? Because we can't predict the future, we can't understand exactly how each individual parcel could function as a development project, right? So this is sounds like a similar challenge that you folks are running into, both for political and policy reasons.
Well, I think just to emphasize what Alan said, that it's yes and, displacement is occurring now. Doing nothing is not an option.
That's right.
And we know it will accelerate if we do nothing. These studies have shown it will mitigate displacement overall, and it is highlighted where we need to focus the resources that Tom described that the city's going to be using. So doing nothing is not an option. Displacement is occurring today.
I want to switch to the other side of the opposition, being the, I went up to Portland to write about this process, not just this but also the rent cap legislation, and talked to a neighborhood activist. Took me around his lovely single-family neighborhood near Reed College. It's beautiful. So he concerns about infrastructure, concerns about parking, concerns about historic homes being torn down and turned into. And his suggestion was, look, we have all these commercial corridors in Portland. Why don't we simply sort of try to funnel growth into those areas? What's been the discussion surrounding those issues?
So I can start at the state level because I would say there were a couple of things that were addressed in the state bill. One was the internal conversion aspect that makes it much easier to internally convert existing homes. That deals with the historic home issue, which was important to the historic preservationists. And there was something else. Oh, and the the issue of limiting this to only areas where there's high-frequency transit. Well, you're limiting, I mean, bus routes are going to change over time, so that seems to be addressing something that's static today that's going to change. We also do a fixed rail. And there are many reasons why neighborhoods are neighborhoods of opportunity, not just whether you're located near transit, and as we're all aging, more and more people need and want to be close to transit. So there's a variety of reasons why. That is just a red herring, I think.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we do, and we actually started with our rezoning, upzoning our commercial corridors, our mixed-use corridors, but that is a certain housing type, right? That is an apartment, a flat, maybe you get 2 bedrooms, and that what the other aspect of this is about housing choice and creating a lot of different housing options, not only for different households, but for different parts of your life cycle, and being able to, you know, when you're an elderly person and you don't want to take care of your big yard, having options in your neighborhood to be able to stay in that neighborhood. And I think that has been part of the conversation. And then more recently, it has been about the exclusive nature of those neighborhoods and beginning to break down some of those barriers as well, to at least opening the door or not having those barriers in the zoning code to different housing types available at different price points.
How long has the Portland discussion about this particular project, or this particular plan, how long has that been going on?
We started in 2015 with a series of advisory committees working up at least concepts.
Yeah.
And then from there have worked out the zoning code details. We got a recommendation out of our Planning and Sustainability Commission after a year of deliberation last spring. And now it's going to start up with our city council in December, and hopefully have something adopted by March.
So, but part of the reason, from my understanding, that why the state bill was passed sort of helped push Portland to move a little bit faster. Then at the same time, Alan, you just said it's good that we're slowing down. So like, what, I mean, is it good that we're slowing down? Should we be moving faster like this? You know, we're now 4 years on, right? Why does this take as long as it does?
Well, I think, you know, these aren't easy problems, right? These are complex problems, and so there are multiple solutions that need to come forward. And when I say slowing down, it's almost to the detriment of the process. You know, I think the nice thing about slowing down is that we've had the opportunity to bring forward this conversation around displacement, around community-led focus. And so another way for us to do that is to move that conversation up front and speed up through that lens. And I think the Anti-Displacement Action Plan actually is an opportunity to do that. It just kind of came at the end. But I think if we could start in those places, we could certainly accelerate. I actually would put that forward to Assemblyman Liu, who talked about going big. And the question is going big at the expense of getting right? And so I think sequencing matters and what lenses we use. And I think we could go fast as long as we're going fast in the right direction. And we absolutely have to. Every one of our communities is experiencing an affordability issue.
And we were remarking, I think, that in that time, the politics around this has really changed.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at what was the initial proposal of triplexes on corners to fourplexes everywhere, you know, we had the color of law and the discussion of exclusionary zoning. We had the state legislation giving us a push. You know, there's a lot of other different political elements that we're going to wind up with a lot more than where we were started if we had passed something in 2017.
Absolutely. I think it initially slowed down because of the hopes of some neighborhood activists that it would go away or become watered down. It's actually gotten stronger. At the state level in 2017, the Speaker of the House, who was also the sponsor of the middle housing bill I described, but in 2017, she proposed a bill that would have allowed ADUs as well as duplexes on all single-family lots in certain cities over a certain size. Back then, the duplex conversation just blew up, and that was taken out of the bill. So in 2017, basically every city in Oregon has to allow ADUs on single-family lots, and that passed. Again, I think Wells got rid of those duplexes. ADUs are looking pretty good right now. In that time between 2017 and 2019, when this bill passed, those conversations about the racist impact of our current zoning were conversations that were happening at the legislative level in ways that were not happening before and in neighborhoods.
So that's a really good question. To follow up on the question I want to ask, which is, like in the city of Minneapolis, Minnesota, the discussion of ending single-family zoning seems frontal in your folks, both in the city of Portland and statewide. And it's interesting here, there were major changes to allow more of these ADUs, granny flats, casitas. I like the term, that term. And talking to some of the folks pushing that policy, they very explicitly said, look, we didn't talk about ending single-family zoning because that's too hot of a political potato to do that. So why do you think, at least in Oregon, that issue, ending single-family, was sort of front and center in these conversations?
Well, we didn't actually call it ending single-family zoning. We said allowing other housing types.
Yeah, but that was, but you didn't. I mean, that was part of the conversation, right?
Yes, it was. But I think as we're seeing it implemented at an even more robust level at the city of Portland, it's all about the size of the box, really. And there is no reason why a duplex is going to have any more impact on infrastructure or parking or anything than a single-family home, for example. So.
Yeah, that was one of the things is like if you have a home and say 4 or 5 college students rent it, how is that any different than a duplex where you have 2 couples and a child or something like, the number of people on that piece of ground is about the same and will have the same similar impacts.
So Oregon's 4 million people, right? 10th the size of California. Median home value, and maybe this has changed since this summer, but about $345,000 in Oregon, which is roughly equivalent to what it is in Stockton here in California. While there are differences in metro areas of Oregon, it's not like we're talking about the big differences you may see in California for San Francisco, LA, San Diego, the Central Valley. Do you think the kind of policy that you folks are pushing is something that you can do in a state that is, bigger, much bigger, with much more sort of different communities like in California?
Absolutely, the housing needs of people aren't any different. The fact that 2/3 of our households everywhere are 1- and 2-person households, and 70% or more of our residential zoning is zoned for detached single-family housing. That looked true in California also. You have to start somewhere. This housing crisis didn't start 10 years ago. It started decades ago with zoning being structurally mismatched to the housing needs, both economic and family size, of people who live in California or Oregon. And it's not going to solve itself overnight, and it's going to take multiple tools. But you got to start somewhere and go big.
I also think for those smaller communities outside the metro area, we haven't seen as much housing production in there. You don't have the larger firms that are building subdivisions and can build 20-unit apartment buildings, but you do have a lot of local builders that can do 4 units and can finance that through the local bank. And I think, the fourplex just gives everybody a lot of room for creativity and to be able different methods of financing and not just traditional bank financing, that you will see a lot of more incremental development that is important in those small towns and communities.
Liam, I'll spin it actually a slightly different way back to that displacement issue, because it actually was that conversation with Richard Rothstein when he was in Portland talking about SB 827, the original bill, and as he framed it, the strange bedfellows that were coming together politically around that, and especially from a fair housing perspective, how groups were lining up. And that's really what triggered my thinking about these pieces that were moving forward, is what side were we on? And he really talked about, these kinds of proposals, where does it make you land on the supply side, the displacement side, or somewhere in between? And that really did touch it off. And so I think California amplifies the same conversation we have that's centered on Portland. And I think that's an important piece that I think, my understanding of the transition from SB 827 to SB 50 is really rooted in part in those conversations. And so I think it's, I don't know what the answer is, but yeah, I think that's even bigger here.
So we're going to get to your audience questions very soon. Please fill out cards, and there'll be folks who are collecting them. I just have a couple more. So I saw, and this is a Portland-specific question, a recent report on an analysis of the plan that's moving forward. Originally, you had proposed, or it was thought that there was going to be 25,000 roughly units that was going to be created. Now it seems like, or the most recent analysis is only 4,000. Why, number one, and number two, where's all this effort just to get that amount of
Right.
Yeah.
I think that is sort of what you're counting in terms of, are we counting likely capacity increases or what we actually think will be built based on a growth rate of about 2% a year, right? So we don't see this as accelerating our growth rate in Portland. So we're planning for 120,000 new households by 2035. And so this rezoning sort of mixes that up. We're not going to get as many apartments as we thought. We're going to get some more duplexes and triplexes in the neighborhood. I think also in there is that sort of economic market question. Where the number of houses less than $400,000 in Portland is rapidly shrinking, and where can you make those numbers work on those new development types? And I think the expectation that we can get 4,000 new units out of that sort of reflects that. That analysis also doesn't include any sort of analysis of what we expect to get on the ADU side as well by allowing a second ADU. And again, it's sort of a snapshot in time and where we think the market is today. But if we sort of enable this legislation, I think there's a lot of creative developers out there that will sort of figure out how to make it work.
Is there any rough estimate or analysis or some idea of kind of statewide the increase in production you hope to have from the bill that passed?
No, not yet, but we expect that the state of Oregon economist is looking at these numbers and has done some numbers. I think for the city of Portland has talked about, there are some numbers coming out of the State Office of Economic Analysis in Oregon that's looked at some Portland numbers and has been speculating on, but I think we'll see those soon.
So this is just occurring to me. Do you folks see this kind of legislation or policy as predominantly a production strategy, an equity strategy, an anti-displacement strategy, environmental strategy, planning? Like, what is if you had to pick one goal of this, which of those buckets does this fall into?
I think it's all of them.
All of them. Certainly
Yeah.
diversity, not just production. We're
Yeah.
not just producing more single-family homes. We're producing diverse housing types in every neighborhood.
And with our urban growth boundaries, that we're getting more efficient out of the urban land, relieving pressure to expand. Or when we expand, a developer can master plan a community and integrate those housing types from the beginning.
And I think it's interesting. It's an almost a Rorschach test, right? That to create the votes to get it to pass at the state level, you had to come at it from both sides. You had to come at it from. You had to go to the supply side folks, the conservative folks, and say, yeah, that's what this is. This is supply side. Here you go. But you also had to go to the more liberal folks and say, yeah, remember when we talked about the exclusionary nature of single-family zoning? This is that thing. I think at the state level, it did leave out some of the displacement conversation, but again, it wasn't as predominant as it is in a place like Portland. So it was an interesting pathway forward to have to address all of those pieces. And for us, the other thing I put on my slide is mind your bedfellows, right? So you also find folks who co-opt a message from the other side that says, wait a minute, the neighborhood folks who are saying, let's not do this because it's going to create the equity issue that the fair housing folks are talking about. Then we have to kind of raise our hand and say, wait a minute, that's not what we said, right? And so it's many different perspectives in one small piece.
What are you all most hopeful for, and what are you all most worried about?
Well, I'm hopeful that this zoning will enable a lot of small builders to get into our neighborhoods, find those opportunities, and take advantage of that. I do worry that on the displacement side that we're not going to be nimble enough to keep up with those pressures in a increasing, rising housing market, and be able to keep up with that. And that's why we've got to keep moving forward with those other strategies beyond the zoning code.
I'm hopeful because this has caused a real public discussion across all audiences of the racist and exclusionary and economically exclusionary nature of past zoning and financing and real estate practices that has bled into other conversations about inclusion, equity, diversity, because our segregated neighborhoods are reflected in our schools and so many other things. And I'm hopeful about this conversation really continuing and infecting so much of the policies that people are having at the neighborhood level and discussions as well as at the state level. I'm not too worried. There's going to be some cities that are going to try to throw up hurdles to implementing this, and I'm not worried about being able to beat those back. We saw that in ADUs. The Speaker of the House came back with a bill and said, no, when I said reasonable, I didn't mean you get to throw up these blockades, and legislation passed to take those out. I do think our challenge is continuing to fund at the state level adequate anti-displacement affordable housing provisions.
I would echo what Mary Kyle says. The ability to have this conversation, I think, is what is so hopeful to me, and that I think it's created the ability for us to see that yes, there is a pathway forward together. Mm-hmm. I think I'm concerned that nobody will listen to that conversation, and that also that there are a large number of forces that we don't control. In all the marketplaces from statewide level to neighborhood level, and we can't always control those or even understand them.
So there's a couple of questions here are good because this is a question I neglected to ask, but it's important for context setting. Mary Kyle, maybe this is good, or at least first directed to you. Oregon does have a longer history of state control over development issues than California does, and planning issues. Your organization exists, and maybe you can talk about how it came to be. Basically, as a keeper of a law that passed in the 70s that aimed to have again a larger statewide jurisdiction over development. Can you speak to a little about that history, number one, and then two, how that played into the context of having kind of more aggressive state action on zoning in this past year?
So I think there are two aspects of that history that are really key in contrast to California. So in 1973, the Oregon legislature passed Senate Bill 100, our statewide comprehensive land use planning program. Every city and county in the state has to adopt a land use plan and zoning code that complies with that. One of those things is housing, and the housing goal requires every city of every size in the state to bring to the table all the zoning tools to provide land zone to meet the housing needs of all Oregonians in location, diversity, and type, all Oregonians of all economic means. So we do not have, or you're not allowed to have, overtly exclusionary housing. What I heard about the allocation of your regional housing needs, so that Beverly Hills does 110 and somebody else has to do a whole bunch more, that you cannot happen within the structure that the state land use planning program establishes. So although this has been the charge to cities, we haven't been fulfilling it, and that's one of the reasons why we have this legislation now. But the idea of a state structure with conforming local land use plans that are evaluated by the state, that's not new. Secondly, that idea that we plan up front for residential, farming, commercial, whatever it is our version and a much more efficient version of your CEQA. We don't have that. The idea is, cities and counties do that planning up front, and then when you come in for a development permit that's consistent with the plan, it's supposed to be relatively easy to get that to yes. It doesn't always work out that way, but there is no environmental impact review unless it's a federal project.
Right. So presumably that history People have lost their minds in here.
I know. I heard a lot of CEQA mentioned. I thought,
They're still taking
it
that
doesn't
in.
mean you can't do
Right.
what we did. I don't want that to get in the way.
Well,
I'll
okay,
Except for the
figure that out.
CEQA consultants.
right. But giving that context, that it is here, what strategies or how replicable is your strategy, given what you may know or may understand about kind of what the process is to do here? Where do you maybe a better way to frame that is, where do you begin to chip away at some of the stronger power that locals have over development control here?
You do have other tools we don't have. You have the state control, much more flexibility over state monies than we do. In Oregon, we have constitutional restriction on the ability to use gas taxes and other things, fees and taxes that come from the operation of a vehicle, can only be used in roadways, et cetera. So you have a lot more tools, I think, of funding, carrots and sticks. I'd be happy to talk more in more detail. I don't know. I don't remember it as much.
Well, and Senator
CEQA.
Weiner also brought up this morning that, the newest piece, if I'd be remiss if I didn't, mention the state level fair housing piece now,
Right.
the requirements around affirmatively furthering. And
Right.
so I think that's vitally important accountability piece, especially if we lose some of that ability at the federal level. So yeah, you're right. I think there are lots of
Yeah,
different
absolutely.
tools around
The fair
accountability
housing.
that we can use here.
Fair Housing in your Housing Accountability Act.
Yeah.
How do you plan to know whether this works or not? Like, what are the metrics that you plan to use to figure that out? I mean, did housing costs go down, or is there like a better thing to think about? And then related to that, like, how do you plan to track this? Is there data components that are part of both the local and state laws?
The state law requires reporting by cities to the state on a variety of elements of House Bill 2001, and we'll certainly be able to see the capacity increases just on the ground in zoning.
Yeah,
The building's going to take a long time.
Yeah, and I think like the map that Alan put up for the last 5 years, we've been tracking displacement and the changes, the demographic changes in our community. And I think that, and that is one of the discussions with our anti-displacement action plan is what are the right metrics? How do you track who's being forced out of the community, who's coming in, how that changes? But I think, if we maintain or grow the share of people of color in our community, we flatten or reduce the number of cost burden households in our community, I think those are some of the metrics that will indicate to us that it's working.
Yeah, and I think we have to recognize, again, that not all of that is in control of just the zoning pieces.
Right.
So there are those other pieces that are going to have to come into place. But if we have one kind of holistic outcome like that we're measuring, even though it's several pieces that are controlling that, then I think that's positive.
Yeah.
Does the bill have higher density requirements around transit or job centers, either the state bill or the Portland effort?
Not the state.
Those are separate efforts. There was a separate state bill to require higher densities near transit that didn't get out of committee. But in Portland, again, there's a companion piece to the single family zoning. We're rewriting our multifamily zoning code right now, and so hopefully by next spring we'll have rewritten the base zone rules, and then we'll go back through and sort of start to relook at the map and be able to expand mixed use and multi-dwelling zoning around our even more than we have on our transit corridors and transit stations.
I presume though you do have some single family zoning near transit still, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So that would not be treated differently than single family zoning, say further out from a rail stop or?
No, not under the current recommendations. We're treating that all equally, except some of the areas where you get into the steeper slopes.
Yeah. So what I'm getting at is in California, they're trying to do both at the same time. Why not in Oregon too?
I think we started out looking at, well, maybe we should upzone the areas close to transit, close to our centers. And I think as the discussion grew, it expanded and it got into the exclusionary nature of single-family homes. And so then the coverage on our map expanded proportionately. And I think it also gets to this housing choice question. Right. So why not? What's so special about transit? Why not duplexes far from transit?
Maybe Mary Kyle, you could speak to why the effort at the state level to further increase density around transit didn't move forward.
Well, Oregon is quite a bit different from California in terms of our transit coverage. Really, only the Portland metropolitan area even has light rail, as well as buses. Eugene, where the University of Oregon is, has a bus rapid transit system. But the rest of the communities are basically band-aiding and paper clipping transit providers together. Right. It's just really at a completely different scale. There are efforts in the Portland metropolitan region, separate from what Tom was talking about, to required increased density around transit nubs and hubs. There was a bill, as Tom mentioned, in the Oregon legislature that would have required allowing increased densities around high-capacity transit stops throughout Oregon. It was really actually hard to define, to even find 20-minute headways. I think we will be going back to that, but it's just at a completely different scale than in California.
So I think I have one more question here. So part of the sort of the upzoning conversations in California, it sounds like in Oregon as well, there's been an inclusionary component reserving certain units for low-income residents. How has those, I presume Portland, and at least Portland has some of those policies already. How have those policies worked?
I think it's too soon to tell. The state had a ban on rent control, which was blocking us from inclusionary housing. That got repealed in 2017, 16?
Inclusionary
yeah.
zoning, 2015.
So the city of Portland is the only city in the state to have passed an inclusionary housing program. It took us 9 months to do that. In that 9-month run-up, before it was affected, we got the equivalent of 5 years worth of development permits in our permit center. So we've been working down that backlog that beat those requirements, and we're just now starting to see how the market and developers are accommodating inclusionary housing into their larger projects. So, we've had this absorption under the old rules that we have to get past. I think there's a lot of other things going on in the market in terms of labor costs and construction costs and vacancy rates that contribute to some of that uncertainty to know how effective that is. That said, 400 plus affordable units have been approved under that program. So that represents quite a bit of what would normally take public subsidy to produce. So
yeah, and I think
we
the hard
are
part
seeing
about
units. Yeah,
I think the hard part about it is not only is it too soon to tell, but it also came too late. Right?
Yeah.
Inclusionary housing, the real upside for it is that it captures that upside in development, and we saw a big piece of that in Portland that didn't have mandatory inclusionary housing, and so we missed a big upside. And now if we're cycling back down, it's a tool that will cycle down in that same way.
Hey, we're going to take a 5-minute break, but before we do that, please let's thank our panel.
Good morning, everyone.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to go ahead and get started here pretty soon. So we're having a lot of great, engaging conversations after that panel. But if you could please make your way back to your seat, we'll get started very, very soon. Again, thanks everybody. Please wrap up and grab your seats. We'll get started shortly. All right, we're going to go ahead and start. So again, thank you all for being with us here this morning. My name is David Garcia. I am the Policy Director at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation, and it is my great privilege to moderate our second and final panel discussion of the morning with three experts in the world of planning who have joined us from across the country to partake in this conversation. So we just heard about what has happened up north in Oregon with our neighbors there, and by any measure what they have been able to accomplish has been an incredible feat. At the same time, as our panel alluded to, it's going to be a long time before we know what the results are of their of HB 2001, of what the city of Portland is going to be doing. And so we can also learn, as we as a state embark on this conversation about land use reform at the state level, we can also be learning from a handful of cities that have done some pretty remarkable things around land use in their own respects. And so with that in mind, we are joined here today by three individuals from three very different places, but each have incredible experience and knowledge instituting some really progressive land use reforms and policies in their communities. And so they're here today to share their experiences, their successes, their challenges, and what and to help us learn about how we should approach the same questions again as we think about how we should be addressing these issues as a state. So with us this morning we have Abe Barge from the city of Denver, we have Vince Bertoni from the city of Los Angeles, and we also have Suzanne Schultz from Grand Rapids. So please join me in welcoming our next panel to the stage. And as our panelists get seated, just a quick reminder that we will do questions and answers at the end of our discussion here. So please be thinking about questions, fill out your note cards, and Terner Center staff will come around and pick those up for you. And then after that, we will be having a broader discussion with all of you over lunch about what we've heard today. So please be thinking about that conversation as well. So thank you again to all of our panelists for being here this morning. Let's just jump right in. Suzanne, I want to start with you.
Okay.
From the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan. We've heard a lot this year about another city that's been getting a lot of headlines for, quote, ending single-family zoning, right? This is the city of Minneapolis, and we hear a lot of really great praise for this plan that they have done, and it has been characterized in many instances as the first city to do this, but it's not entirely true, right? It's because Grand Rapids effectively ended single-family exclusive zoning almost 10 years ago. So, and not only that, this is from an article in Next City. They quoted you as saying that when it came time for the city to approve the plan, that not one person came up in opposition of the plan. So that tells me one of two things, that either your staff did an incredible job cultivating support, or that Midwesterners really are just super nice. So I have a feeling maybe a combination of both. So please, can you just tell us how Grand Rapids was so seemingly ahead of its time? What were the decisions that drove you to, quote unquote, end single-family zoning?
Sure. I'll give a little context for Grand Rapids too, just so people, if you don't know about Grand Rapids, we're a mid-sized city, 200,000 people within Michigan. If you have your Michigan map out, it's at the base of your pinky, and we've been very fortunate. It's very different than other places people think of in Michigan. And Michigan has a very cyclical economy, so it's also very interesting from that standpoint when you think of Rust Belt cities. We had undergone, for the first time in 40 years, an update to the city's master plan. The prior master plan had been adopted in 1963. And they decided, well, maybe, it's been 40 years. I guess we'll update the plan. The prior one before that had been 1923, so it seems to be the cycle that we had been on. And in those discussions with the community, we went to every neighborhood and business association. We had over 250 community meetings. And the conversation about smart growth really came up. The foundation for smart growth principles, to have mixed use, to focus on multiple modes of transportation, variety of different housing types at a range of different price points, allowing development processes to be clear and easy to understand, and do it in collaboration really were the themes that sort of emerged throughout the plan process. And so when it came time to write the zoning ordinance then to implement that plan, there was a lot of discussions about what that meant. And we called it the pattern workbook. We actually looked at every neighborhood association and encouraged people to participate in that plan process to talk about what do we have now? How do I codify character of a neighborhood? And so a lot of discussion came around what is there? And a lot of people started to observe, well, our traditional neighborhood isn't all single family. There's a duplex and there's a small apartment building on the corner that we didn't develop like this, just all exclusive single family in our traditional neighborhoods. And then there were nuances noticed further out in more of the suburban area, the donut around the downtown, where even then we had duplexes mixed in some cases. So the conversation really became, well, do we have single family zoning or is it something else? And I think I was really surprised because as I was starting to draft the zoning ordinance, we had a work group of neighborhood leaders that we constantly engaged. And my original assumption was going to be that we were going to have a single family zone district. And after that conversation, we kind of came back and challenged everyone and said, what if we had a mixed density zone district and a low density zone district to kind of characterize that? But we had by right development for all housing types in mixed density and in residential in all business districts. And then in our low density, we'd even allow that as long as there's an additional level of review with the Planning Commission, which in Grand Rapids is one meeting and it takes 5 weeks to get through. With about a 96% approval rate. So, and the community, we were so lucky, went along with it. I mean, you heard some of the details at the very beginning of today's discussion about those details and the nuances in the details. So, for example, can you convert an existing structure was part of the discussion. So there's been a lot of ongoing conversation about it. But yeah, 2007 is when the zoning ordinance was adopted. We went and lived with it for a year and then repealed it and approved a new zoning ordinance in 2008 after we had time to live with it, because that was the first time since 1969 the city had had a new code and it had been amended over 300 times. So when we went back even, the mayor asked if we wanted immediate effect, and there was no one who showed up in opposition. So it went quite well.
Wow. So to that's all you can really say. And so you had 10 years with zoning roughly, and and that spans basically an economic cycle, both the boom and the bust. Can you tell us what the results have been from that change 10 years ago? Do single-family homes not exist anymore in Grand Rapids? Has it done what is anticipated to do, and what metrics do you have around that?
Yeah, so so when it was adopted, we were just starting to go, and Michigan was just starting to go into the recession. I mean, it's not, everybody marks like into 2008. So we adopted right where we're in the trough, and we weren't really getting any building permits except for electronic message centers and liquor stores. So after coming out of the bust, we did start to see a huge pickup. So we've had over 6,000 housing units built. And for Grand Rapids, when you're talking about 200,000 people, that's a good number. We had 6,000 housing units built. Most of those have been, about 2/3 of those have all been administratively approved. So they don't go to a board or commission for approval. We staff it, we do it all through administrative processes. We have developers who come from out of the state come into Grand Rapids and ask, what this place is. They don't understand they're like, where's the catch? What's the next thing to do? Because we've really streamlined the development approval process to try to make it as easy and predictable as possible for them to get it done. And that's in contrast to the city of Detroit that has had about 1,500 housing units built during the same time. That just gives you a kind of a contrast on the scale. But we've seen most of it has been multifamily. In fact, very few single family. We're about 98% built out. And so most of it has been along commercial corridors, although there are properties like church properties and others that we're starting to see row houses and apartments built in. By far, it's been multifamily.
Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of having this buy right quick approval process? Because as you heard here, that is a kind of a foreign concept here in the state of California. So how important was having some simplicity in the planning process for these changes to be effective?
I think the stream of it was for the community to say, what do you want and what don't you want? Or how is it going to look and how is it going to work up front? So you're establishing those expectations at the beginning, and then I'm codifying those expectations on the back end. So if there's an issue and a developer's coming in and they're trying to do something that doesn't meet the community expectations, then they have process. But if they can comply with what the community wants, then it's a relative, we've tried to simplify it as much as possible. The buy right, as we're seeing more development and there's concern about displacement, we've always been in the top 3 hottest real estate markets. In fact, the 49505 zip code, according to the latest news articles, is the hottest zip code in the country. There's been concerns about that. It's a double-sided coin when you're talking about gentrification, though, because we're also seeing people who've been in neighborhoods that didn't build wealth before be able to build wealth. Those homeowners that have waited it out, that were the only ones who could buy on land contract in the 70s, those families are now being able to build wealth in their homes. And so it's been a little bit tricky for us on saying, well, we have wealth building activities, but we also have displacement happening. And how do we manage that with understanding this increase in by right development?
Sure, and that's a really key piece, and I want to come back to that with the whole panel in a moment. But actually, I want to go to Abe Arch, your principal planner for the city of Denver. The city of Denver actually just underwent a significant a comprehensive plan review, so to speak. And I don't want to get to that in a moment, but I actually want to talk about what the experiences Denver has had over the last 10 years, because about 10 years ago, Denver went through a zoning update that basically loosened multifamily building in some areas, but certainly not all, but has led to some multifamily building in different parts of the city where it hadn't seen it before, which not everyone has been happy with. There was a recent article in Marketplace that was titled "The Invasion of the Duplexes," that basically characterized the construction of duplexes in these places as boxy, going lot line to lot line, and just kind of invading these single-family areas. So I want to ask a little bit about what were the changes that facilitated this quote-unquote invasion, Marketplace's words, not mine, and really that seems a little hyperbolic. What has the actual experience been in Denver? And then maybe we can transition into a conversation about Blueprint Denver, which is their comprehensive plan.
Sure, yeah, I think from the perspective of a lot of residents in Denver, invasion is not hyperbolic. We haven't even gone as far as Grand Rapids and the other cities that we're talking to, but for decades, Denver has had a pretty flexible zoning code, especially with regard to design. And then in 2010, when we adopted the form-based zoning code rewrite for the city, in many cases, flexibility increased, particularly to do smaller scale infill. And I think what the Marketplace article was focusing on, which has received a lot of attention in Denver, is the relative ease of, in contexts that are primarily single family, like in the existing reality, they're not zoned as such, that it's pretty easy, even on smaller lots, to insert new building types. And without very many design restrictions, we get things like it's really probably the duplexes are the least of it. There's another thing that people call mostly slot homes. Some people call them fro homes or faux row homes, which is my favorite term, which are these things that turn their sides to the street and are built down the length of a lot. The diagrams that Tom showed of the fourplexes and things that had street presence in Portland's plans are just magical by comparison with these slot homes. And so we have a lot of that happening, and it's led to a real feeling that the growth only brings negative change. And I think, when on top of that, the units in these buildings are mostly actually pretty large and therefore really expensive, that the change isn't bringing any kind of affordability. It is more housing, but it's housing that has just, I think, felt pretty negative to a lot of neighborhoods.
Can you talk a little bit about where you are seeing these duplexes or fro townhomes or whatever the terminology is? Where in Denver are they happening, and is the idea moving forward with Blueprint Denver to kind of expand more areas where more infill can happen?
Yes, so the areas that the fro homes, slot homes are happening are kind of predictable. The more desirable neighborhoods towards the center of the city that have a kind of charming established character, and also just the kinds of places where you'd expect infill to replace single unit, which is larger lots, smaller single unit houses where the economics of that work out. So in those neighborhoods, there's really been a lot of change. What Blueprint Denver, which is the newly adopted land use and transportation plan, says is that we need to do a lot more on the design side to promote compatibility. It also says something similar to what Minneapolis's new comprehensive plan says, maybe a little less directly, but that is that we need to expand housing options, including in areas that are zoned single unit. And so we're in implementation of Blueprint Denver, we're taking on both of those things simultaneously. The concerns about design, though, are going to, inevitably create a big headwind for the conversation about housing options, because there's so much distrust already in what change can look like, that we're going to need to be really careful to, on the one hand, satisfy neighborhoods that we're doing enough about design in order to open things up in terms of options, and at the same time not make the design side of things so restrictive that we're actually preventing housing supply. So, Elizabeth had some little diagrams on her slides that showed kind of the restrictive bulk planes and then the sort of remove all the restrictions, look how much more you can get. Well, we're on the look how much more you can get side right now, and actually are going to need to make a little bit of a compromise, I think, in order to sell this.
Thank you. I want to bring in Vince Bertoni, who is the planning director for the city of Los Angeles. Los Angeles has undertaken a pretty progressive change that is different than what the two other cities we have up here represent. And of course, I'm talking about the transit-oriented communities program, which focuses exclusively on kind of transit adjacent corridors and whatnot. And so this is actually something the Terner Center has written about, and we have said is somewhat of a model the other cities could adopt. So my question really is, can you explain TOC briefly for the folks who are not familiar with it, and talk a bit about how effective it has been? Has there been a big uptake from developers, because it is kind of an incentive-based program?
Right. So TOC is an outgrowth of a ballot initiative measure, JJJ, that was passed by the voters of LA in November of 2016. It had about 65%, I believe, approval. And that ballot initiative was put on by a coalition of labor and advocates of equity in the various neighborhoods of Los Angeles. And the initiative primarily focused on upzoning in the city. If someone was to come in and upzone some property, they would have to do basically two things: provide wages that were similar to union wages, and then provide a certain portion of that project as affordable. There was another provision in there called transit-oriented communities incentives, and this directed the planning department to come up with incentives in a very short order, within 90 days, and it was to come up with incentives for housing that similar to a density bonus. So if you provide a certain amount of housing as affordable, you get relief from development standards, and it was defined as something within a half mile of transit. And it was tied to the state density bonus law, so it did not apply. It only applied to 5 or more units, so it did not apply to anything such as a single family or duplex zoning. And so that's something where we had, and the interesting thing about it was, we came up with the incentives. They go to our city planning commission for their comment, and it comes back to us for adoption. So there was no review by city council or appeal or anything like that. So this was a very intentional initiative that wanted to, although it was through a political process, you have an initiative, I believe it tried to come up with these incentives, with limiting that political involvement, if you will. And so what we did was, we looked at the city, and actually have a slide up here, go to this one. So what we did is, if you're familiar with Los Angeles, we're in the kind of darker gray. The slide on the left shows where those transit-oriented communities incentive areas are. And they're based around where we have Metro Rail, which is either a subway or light rail line, or we have buses where 2 bus lines come together. And the map on the left is the existing boundaries. And we created it in basically 4 tiers. You get the greatest amount of incentives if you're very close to a rail station, and then it kind of tiers off in terms of if you're farther from a rail, or if you're not from rail, you're where 2 buses come together. So that's what you see on the left. If you look on the right, that's actually a map as of this summer of where all of the entitlements have gone. And you can start to see where the concentration of those entitlements are. It's ended up being, the ballot initiative was adopted in November was signed, it was certified in December of 2016, and those dates are somewhat important because it actually has a 10-year lifespan. And we adopted the incentives in September of 2017. And so within less than a 2-year period of time, starting actually about 1.5 years or so into it, right now our projects going through our TOC incentives represent roughly half of all of our planning entitlements now. So it's half of all of our units are going through our TOC incentives. That's important because remember, you have to have a certain percentage of those to be affordable. So that's roughly about 20% of those projects are affordable. So you think about all the cities that are doing mandatory inclusionary, and I think San Francisco's is somewhere around 20% or around now, I forget where theirs is. We're having an incentive program provide the same number of affordable housing as a lot of inclusionary programs are doing. Another thing to keep with it is we had a narrow window of time to really come up with incentives. We had about 90 days. So we worked very fast. We worked with an economic consultant to give us some back of the envelope analysis because we wanted to do a few things with this. One of them was we knew through JJJ that the wage part of JJJ could potentially be a disincentive for smaller development for wood frame construction because those kind of wages you would typically do for high-rise but not for wood frame. So we wanted to see if we could provide a balance for the TOC to make sure that we don't lose wood frame construction because it's an important part. It can be smaller and be integrated into neighborhoods easy. And the balance of the units I won't call affordable, but they're not quite as expensive as high-rise when it comes to the market. We also, being in a crisis, we have a homelessness crisis in LA as so much of the state, the coast do. We wanted to incentivize extremely low income, which is 30% of area median income, which is basically $20,000 a year for a household of one. And because we wanted to make sure that we could really address those people who are most at risk of experiencing homelessness. So that has been successful. I think something like 80% of our projects are fewer than 50 units, which is typically wood frame. Out of those projects that are the affordable category of projects, roughly 45% are extremely low income. So we're really happy with that. And and another thing, if you just look, thought I'd just look at the housing production in the state of California versus the city of Los Angeles. And the interesting thing, if you look at that, so the upper one, which is in green, is the state of California. The lower in blue is the city of LA. And you can see we've had some rises and falls. We actually have the highest housing production we've had since around 1988, 1989. So in 30 years, we're producing the most housing we've done in 30 years. You can see our housing production dropped off when we had the end of the Cold War and we lost the aerospace industry. You saw a big drop off, then we had a recovery, and then we had the Great Recession. But the interesting thing, you can kind of see an uptick at the very end, which coincides with our TOC program. And so you can see the TOC uptick in our housing production, and you can see that we're in a very different trajectory in essence than where the state of California is. And if you look at, I actually have one of San Francisco and San Diego, and it makes us look very different than the rest of them. So we're doing, in terms of our housing production now, we're 10% of the state population, yet we're 20% of all the housing production. If you look at LA County, we're 40%, we're 4 out of the 10 million. We're 40% of the county population, but we're something like 75% or more of all the apartment production. And we're actually, I think we're 40%, I think we're 85%, excuse me, get my numbers right, of the apartment construction. So we're actually like doubling really where we are in terms of our per capita housing production. So it's been something that's been very successful, we think, over the time. Clearly there's a lot of different opinions out there about whether it's good or bad for communities.
So I want to follow up on something you mentioned, is that TOC does not apply to single-family homes or small units. So can you speak a little bit about why that decision was made, and if that, in your opinion, makes it more or less impactful? Obviously, part of this is political and getting community buy-in to support something, but also from a zone capacity perspective, is limiting TOC or excluding TOC to single-family areas that hinder the ability to get the most out of it.
So the initiative itself limited it. So the initiative itself didn't give us the ability to provide incentives for single family. It gave us a minimum threshold of incentives, but didn't give us a maximum. So we had flexibility to do more incentives, not fewer, but it did not give us the ability to apply it to any place at 4 or fewer units. So that was a limitation of there. And I think that not having a lot of conversations about it with the people who drafted it, the initiative, I think that they were looking at, quite frankly, getting the broadest support for their initiative, JJJ, and not dealing with that part of the single family. What it has is it's really focused, it's allowed us to produce a lot of housing around both the transit and in our corridors. So I think and I think that's a lot, there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit there in the cities. I think I was just back in Boston with the planning directors of the 30 largest cities, including Portland's and Denver's, and Minneapolis, who's also done some single-family zoning. I think we all have come together in saying that our corridors are really some of the most, throughout America, are probably the areas that we have so much low-hanging fruit that we could produce a lot more housing. We have a lot of, in LA, we allow multifamily, not just in multifamily zones and mixed-use zones, but all commercial zones allow it. So we've seen a lot of TOC going into commercial zones, and we have our main clusters. If you look at the map on the right, we're getting a lot in Koreatown. We're getting a lot in Hollywood and East Hollywood, and a lot of those, and now historic Filipino town, we're getting a lot in these areas, and a lot of them are either surface parking lots or one-story commercial buildings and commercial zones.
Can you talk a little bit more about that coalition? You mentioned this is a ballot initiative, which is a very kind of, that's not typically how these planning processes play out. So, I mean, what was that experience kind of, basically taking direction from a ballot initiative that was approved overwhelmingly, but also had a big coalition around it to push it forward?
Well, I think you're always, you always have caution as a planner having to come and implement regulations not written necessarily by planners, to think, what am I going to find in here as I look through the pages? What's the next provision I'm going to find, and how am I going to implement? Do they understand how to really write this with zoning? It was written, I think, largely by ACT LA, which is a kind of an umbrella organization around organizations that deal with housing and job equity, and really issues of equity in a lot of our diverse communities in Los Angeles. And some of the ACT LA and a lot of their member organizations we've worked with over the years as we've developed our community plans. And so we had a very strong relationship with them. And I've talked to them about it, and they based their TOC program in the initiative around their years of experience as they've gone and advocated for equity in housing in these communities in Los Angeles. And when we took it, it was very well written, whether you like or don't like it. There's different opinions about it, but it was a very well written initiative, which was very specific and very intentional in what it needed to do. So when we took it, we actually based how we did our TOC incentives around our experience around doing density bonus projects. And I think that is what made it work. It wasn't just something that came up as this is what our idea would be in the future. ACT LA and their member organizations spent a lot of time thinking about what worked and didn't work in their projects, and we spent time thinking about what worked and didn't work in our density bonus program.
Got it. And you say, folks who don't like it, can you talk about what the pushback has been on it?
The pushback has largely come from some single-family neighborhoods who have been experiencing it on the edges. I would say we haven't had pushback everywhere on it. Most of our projects go through without opposition, but we have had some opposition, and they've been largely fearful in some single-family neighborhoods about what the heights of buildings are going to be nearby them.
Got it. And that actually leads me to a question I want to throw out to the panel is, these are pretty, in many cases, these are pretty significant changes that you're having to have conversations about in a lot of places that have not seen changes in decades. And so we've all had various levels of success up here. Can each of you speak to kind of how you broach those conversations and how you've been successful in moving that needle? Again, I guess, Suzanne, we can start with you again, because you had no people come up to oppose. So it feels like
I think there might have been one or two. I mean, it was no one was storming it.
Margin of error.
Yeah, the education, I think, is absolutely critical, and having those conversations about if you want better transit in the grocery store in your neighborhood business district, you need density. And so, what are the talking points that you're using with those neighborhoods to get them to see the upside, and to figure out how to ameliorate the downside if it's parking or other things. So we've transitioned, for example, to a neighborhood permit parking program to address residential parking issues. So there's always kind of this, I always struggle because I think there's a nuisance side to some of this stuff that if you look at it from a management operational perspective versus taking it out of zoning. And how do you loosen up on zoning and let a whole range of things? Most zoning codes used to be 30 pages long. I mean, they weren't 300.
Right.
And so how do you strip away and get to what's most important and simplify it in a way that the community can understand it and articulate their goals and their vision in a way that they're connecting the dots, that they see we're headed here, how do we get there, and this is the path. And I think we've been successful in having those conversations. We had a recent initiative, you'll see on the chart that was handed out in 2018, there were some amendments that were made to the zoning. And it was interesting because the community didn't come out in opposition necessarily to the amendments. They came out in opposition to the process that was used to make the amendments. That there was a steering committee that was appointed, and that group of 20 to 30 people was starting to make decisions and making recommendations to the city commission, but the community at large was not part of that discussion. And they called foul on it, and they said, this isn't how we've normally done things. We want to be part of this discussion. We're opposed, but we think there might be other solutions that you haven't evaluated, and we want to have a more robust discussion about it. So it was a really interesting, I think, turn in process on what the community is expecting as far as their level of involvement in decision making around housing reform.
Got it. And Abe, what's been the experience in Denver?
Well, I think we've been pretty successful at allowing growth and change to occur around transit and along corridors. That hasn't been that difficult of a conversation. Some corridors, yes, and removing parking requirements and providing density bonuses and all of that has been going well. It's really when we get into the neighborhoods that it's a big challenge, and there is going to have to be a lot of education about that. Interestingly, like the old blueprint Denver, which is about 15 years old now, that our new plan replaces, was based around this concept of areas of stability and areas of change. And the whole city was in either one or the other. And most of it was stability, because that was like the single unit, the 2-unit zone districts. The areas of change were the corridors and transit-oriented areas. Well, that was a very easy to understand concept and really supported the channeling of growth towards transit. It led to a lot of expectation that that's where all of the growth would go, and that this terminology, area of stability, meant nothing can happen, which was never the intention. But the new plan removes that terminology, and it just has much more of a gradient of change. We still, I think, like the other cities, well, certainly Portland, like have the expectation that most of the growth realistically is still going to happen in those areas that were previously called areas of change. But if that's what happens, we're only getting one housing type, which is these big multifamily projects. And we need to look at the 70% of the city that's in the other category and get different housing types, spread the conversation around about equity, and allow different kinds of people to live throughout the whole city. It is, as I mentioned, it's going to be really challenging.
So speaking of that challenge, I think I framed that question in a way that really spoke to, how do you discuss this with single-family homeowners in the more affluent communities who are more likely to be engaged in the planning process than other groups? So I want to kind of turn that question on its head, and it's something that was alluded to in the previous panel. A lot of communities view things like their existing zoning, whether it's single family or low density, as protecting them against issues of displacement. And so my question for the panel is, how has this conversation played out in your communities, and how have you been able to alleviate those concerns? I think we can probably have a discussion about the extent to which we think that happens. But the fear is there, and it's real, because a lot of these communities, especially here in California and around us here in the Bay Area, they are seeing displacement. And so, and to be honest, zoning has not always been a force for good change for a lot of these communities. And so how do you build trust with these communities and address these concerns? We'll throw it out to whoever wants to take that first.
I could just start with, we're just starting the conversation about the housing options in the lower density and single unit neighborhoods. It's already come up, in the Blueprint Denver conversation. Don't just recommend eliminating single family zoning. Don't just recommend saying that you can have as many ADUs as you want everywhere, because that just supports real estate speculation. And real estate speculation displaces people and doesn't benefit existing neighborhood residents. So we've got to figure out how to balance that conversation. I think some of the ideas that are going to be central are around making sure that, particularly in lower income neighborhoods, that there are programs in place to help the existing residents take advantage of the new options. So we've rolled out a program that actually provides low interest loans and grants for lower income people to build ADUs, for example. And I don't know how realistic this is. Hopefully I can talk to others here about this, but the idea that in some places where there's a greater vulnerability to displacement, the ability to take advantage of some of the new housing options that would be available would only be available to nonprofit builders like Habitat for Humanity and things like that.
Vince, this is a particular issue in Los Angeles, given that a lot of communities that are at risk of displacement are lower density.
Right, and that was one of the things that came up when we had some state laws dealing with this a few years ago. If you look at SB 50 and so forth, we spent like 10 years adopting our 3 community plans in South LA, the West Adams, the South and South LA community plans. And we worked really carefully with the communities. In fact, ACT LA and a lot of their member organizations that wrote basically the TOC incentives. And the struggle that happened, the conversation that happened with some potential changes with single family is unlike maybe other cities, there's a lot of single family and duplex zoning in the city of Los Angeles, which is long held community color. And they're very established, very multi-generational community color neighborhoods. And so I think the conversation that we heard was less about maintaining the single family home as much about we spent 10 years working very carefully and we understand where these community plans are and we understand the trade-offs that we've made. And now we're upsetting the apple cart in the plans that we helped shape and that we feel is going to create the communities that we want to create. And now something's going to come in as a blunt instrument and change that. And so the conversation was less about the sanctity of the single family home, but more about the process and their ability to affect the change in their neighborhood.
And Suzanne, you alluded to this question too in your comments, so I'm curious how this conversation has played out in Grand Rapids.
Yeah, so we have a couple interesting things. Michigan law is interesting in that property taxes for homeowners are capped and that they actually only increase the rate of inflation. So when we hit the recession, it was really bad because property values dropped and you can only increase them at the rate of inflation. You can't rebound it. So homeowners don't really get priced out as you have new investment around them. And so they're kind of in a different group, and that's part of the discussions we have is that homeowners really aren't the ones getting priced out unless they're looking, if they're relocating, then that's an issue. They can't stay in their neighborhood. But if they're currently in their existing home, that's one thing. Renters, as everyone knows, is the most vulnerable population, and how do you address renters? And Michigan does not allow anything on any form of rent control to be applied. It's prohibited by state law. And so that has been a big issue and a big topic of discussion for us is how do you keep people here? Because if you look at the demographics, you're seeing increases in poverty in the suburbs surrounding Grand Rapids as people are being displaced and moved out into surrounding jurisdictions. And part of that is we just recently changed our density bonus so that it applies to that 30% AMI or below to sweeten the pot for affordable housing providers to be able to do that. We're very active with our state, Michigan State Housing Development Authority, to get LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit projects within the city. But it's in 60 units or more. It's not it's not a single-family home. So the importance of home dollars from the federal government and being able to get people to purchase, get people into home ownership has been a big topic of discussion. How do we do that? A housing trust fund was recently set up to be able to try to fund those initiatives, to try to get people to stay in place. Community benefits agreements are another thing that we're talking about. Some success has been happening in Detroit. We're not sure whether or not it's going to be challenged at the state law level because, it's Michigan. But community benefits agreements, we think, have the potential to be able to do that because we can tie that into economic incentives. So if a developer's coming in for brownfield or some sort of tax abatement, then we could tie in community benefits agreements to try to prevent displacement or at least have payments so that people, if they're relocating, they have the resources to be able to either buy then if they're a renter, which has happened, or to locate similarly into a different neighborhood.
Got it. We have just a few minutes left before we get to the questions we received from the audience. And so, again, we're here to think about how the state should be approaching getting involved in land use, or really should the state get involved in land use. So that's my question for each of you to answer quickly is what role do you believe that the state has in determining land use patterns at the local level, with a kind of a bit of a caveat too, an understanding that each of you have undertaken some pretty innovative, progressive-looking policies. Not all cities are going to do that, and to the extent that housing markets are regional, they don't stop at city limits. Is there a role for the state to play in these instances?
For me, that's a tough one because I'm a local control gal. So I'll totally admit that I struggle with that. But I think it's what is the state, where are you releasing, control, and where are you allowing for those carrots? We've talked about carrots before, but for example, the state of Michigan now has started a redevelopment ready community program. And to be RRC certified means your master plan's up to date, your zoning ordinance is up to date, you have a clear development review process, and they're tying that to tax incentives now. so that the expectation is you have to be RRC certified to be able to start eventually being able to get the state's brownfield dollars. And I think that is a really interesting strategy, that if we could layer that with affordable housing, and it's that carrots, if you're going to have new development in your community, what is that, and how do you incentivize that, and how do you streamline it in different approaches? I think also on a more regional level, one of the discussions we've been having in our county is transfer of development rights. And usually that's used for farmland preservation, but the question of how do you, is there an opportunity to use that as an economic development tool to think about property rights in different ways? If there's areas that have to be preserved, how do they transfer? How do they do that? And then also, affordable housing is the housing that you're already in. So if you're avoiding displacement, are there neighborhood protection zones or something that you can think of? One of the challenges with that, though, is if you look at other places that have had long histories of growth, out east is a really great example where in Columbia, you were only supposed to have growth and development on your corridors and not in your neighborhoods. And now they've maxed that out. And how do you get more development now all over? And everybody has really long memories if they are property owners and homeowners and neighborhoods. So from a state level, I think there's just a lot of creativity that has to happen, but a lot of advocacy, and those carrots, the dollars do help. I think I appreciated the comment that was made, though, if you're not hungry, carrots, it doesn't. I think that was a really great comment.
Vince, state role in local land use.
Shoot, I thought we were going to A. I thought we would get the out-of-staters one first. Look, I think that I've worked in local government my whole career, but I spent a lot of time working with state law. I think there's definitely a role for the state, and I think that you have to look at that role as what our purpose is. And we're looking at statewide, making sure that we can have a competitive economy, and that we can also address issues that are so important like climate change. And I think that that's where the state needs to pay attention to. I think the state has a role. It has a role to take care of those things that are of statewide interest. I think that it's most successful when it stays closest to its goals. It sometimes breaks down when they get a little bit into the weeds, but it'd be great for the cities in the LA region to share housing. Those cities that are creating jobs should be creating housing. It shouldn't be that LA is producing some like 85% of all of the apartments in the county of Los Angeles. There needs to be those areas that are having the jobs should be that are producing the jobs need to be producing housing. There needs to be more equity with it.
Abe, quickly, state role in local housing.
Well, it's a bit of an alien idea because I think Colorado is a little bit more like Michigan than California in that regard.
So let me rephrase it then. If you were in a state that was considering a statewide intervention, as a local planner with local experience in doing the work that you do and understanding the housing market in your region generally, what would you recommend that the state should be doing, if anything?
Well, I agree with Vince that avoid getting into the weeds because that can just create a kind of one-size-fits-all situation that might be kind of challenging at the local level. But at the same time, I think it probably is important for the state to intervene. That Denver is less than a third the population of the Denver metro area, like the city of Denver. We can't solve all the problems. No matter what we do, what the other cities, what the suburbs are doing matters, and they may well continue to do nothing unless the state intervenes. And so I think that's important to level the playing field.
Got it.
There's one other thing I wanted to add. Either Minneapolis or Wisconsin has a revenue sharing model between jurisdictions that is something that has been quite effective in talking about winners and losers, and how do you share that revenue across jurisdictions on a more regional level as you're talking about where jobs are, where you have your roads go to, where the housing is. And I think that has facilitated some changes that otherwise wouldn't have happened.
Great. We did have a couple questions. I want to get them very quickly. There was a question about, because Blueprint Denver doesn't say we're going to change the zoning on every parcel, just in the different areas, is there a concern that you are leaving some capacity on the table?
Well, Blueprint Denver doesn't say end single-family zoning, but it does say that there should be expanded housing options in what Blueprint Denver calls low and low-medium residential areas, which include all single-unit and two-unit areas of the city. And then it specifically says that expanded housing options include duplexes, fourplexes. And so it basically indirectly does say, look everywhere for opportunities. While at the same time, there is the expectation, it's on the chart here, that most of the growth is not going into those places, but more of it is going to start going into those places.
Question for Vince. It's a very pointed question. It's very basic.
I'm used to them.
Should LA have single family zoning around transit?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Not loaded at all.
No, it's not loaded at all. Not understand. Look, we're actually, when we did our Expo Line Transit Neighborhood Plan, so that's the one that goes, Expo Line goes from downtown Los Angeles up to Santa Monica, and we did the kind of the more western phase of it. We actually rezoned some properties around some stations, or one station, the Bundy station, from single family to multifamily. We're actually looking at we're looking at in the Southeast Valley as we do those community plan updates around transit. We're looking at gentle density of going from single family to fourplexes. I think that I don't believe generally in blunt approaches anywhere, especially in a place of 470 square miles. I mean, we're 4 million people, like I think Oregon is 4 million, so I guess we're the same amount of people as Oregon. I didn't realize that. I think that we should always be looking at abilities to do things besides single family near transit. I'm not a fan of blunt instruments. I don't know that they're very effective. If you look at our TOC program, which has been effective, was more nuanced. It created tiers, and it created a layering effect of incentives layered by tiers, which I think has provided a certain effect. So I think that's the better way to go. Our ADU ordinance has been, regulations have been successful. That is actually a successful state program where we actually, the state passed some laws in ADUs, and they most of them went into effect by January 1st of 17. And prior to that, we had around 80 ADUs a year. Now we're getting about over 5,000. I throw that in the fact that there are other things happening in single-family zones with new ADU laws coming into effect this next January 1st that's going to allow you an ADU plus a junior ADU. So what is a single-family home is inherently changing under state law anyway.
Got it. Suzanne, next question is for you. You mentioned the education for the community members on the upsides of zoning changes and density. And so when it comes to individual projects, is it incumbent upon the developers to do that public outreach, or what responsibilities do they have in that regard, given that it seems like the process is fairly streamlined?
We do require developers to go out and meet with neighborhoods. With the administrative approval process, it's a little clunky because it's how much say does the neighborhood have over their development project if it meets the ordinance. But I think developers have found that there's a value in having those conversations with the neighborhoods because they realize how good they have it right now. and part of it, we appeal to the developer side of it and say, you want this to go well because we don't want to have backlash in the long run where all of a sudden now everything has to go to review. So it's in your best interest for the future to be able to go have those conversations and build those relationships with the neighbors, so you have those conversations. And it's not always, unicorns and glitter. It's, there's always these challenges that do come up. But I think in general, we've been very lucky that our development community has been good at listening, and the neighbors have been good at providing feedback. We have neighborhoods that have development review committees, because they've been involved in the whole process of master plan updates or their own neighborhood master plan and zoning rewrites, that they are pretty articulate when it comes to defining what their expectations are and working with developers. And then in some cases, the planning department's kind of served as the arbiter of kind of that negotiation sometimes. But overall, it has not been as controversial as you would think it would be, but it's also not been perfect.
Got it. So very, very last question for the panel is we are very fortunate to be joined by so many individuals and organizations here who are directly involved in housing policy across California. What would each of you say should be the takeaway from the experiences you've each individually had in your cities? For the folks here, everyone watching on the live stream, what should they be taking away from this?
for me, it's how simple can you make all of this? I mean, it's a super complex topic. And as you're talking about what's your end goal and defining that goal, whether it's a number. So we had an area in a neighborhood where we said we need to provide 300 new affordable housing units because the school population is being affected. And once we start that target, we worked with nonprofits to make that happen. But it was just that idea of a number. So the simpler you can make this in defining it, even though it's a super complex thing, I think makes it easier for the public to understand and digest, and for policymakers to be able to express it. But then the role behind the curtain as professionals is how do you make all those little mechanisms work in a way that appears seamless, but it's messy.
Yeah, simplicity is good for sure, and as is, holding off on the desire to do conditional approvals and have a lot of negotiation where individual neighborhoods actually do have a really specific role in the approval of a development. Obviously, that's challenging. But at the same time, I think the one thing I can bring from Denver's experience is that we've done pretty well on the simplicity and on the by right side, but that's led, or that's been part of this kind of backlash against growth because there's been too little neighborhood conversation about the things that are happening, and that the design rules, at least in zoning, are too simple. So we're going to need to correct that a little bit, I think.
Great question. I would just say, I would echo simplicity. If you wonder why things take so long to get through the planning process, because the codes are incredibly complex and incredibly difficult to implement. So if you want things to go more quickly, you make sure that you have to really advocate for simpler codes. Advocate, design matters, so they're going to have to be designed well, and that's going to have to be part of the process. And equity is important. We're going to have to really pay attention to how do we create equitable communities.
Got it. Thank you. Well, I'm hearing simplicity across the board, so
Yes.
it sounds easy, right? With that, I just would like to thank each and every one of you for being here this morning and joining us here in the Bay Area. This has been an incredibly enlightening conversation for me, and I hope it has been for everybody here. So with that, if you please join me in thanking our panel for being with us this morning. So we have, now that we have concluded our panel discussions, I'd like to bring up three distinguished individuals who will kind of discuss their closing thoughts, so to speak, for the day, what they've heard, what they've taken away from this conversation. Hopefully that'll be a lead-in for the conversation that we have with all of you here afterwards as well. So please welcome Ben Metcalf, who is the principal of Stronger Foundations, but most of you probably also know him as the former director of the California Department of Housing and Community Development. Welcome back, Carol Galante, and my colleague, Carolina Reed, the faculty research advisor at the Terner Center. So welcome.
Thank you. I have to say, I'm going to turn this over to Ben Metcalf for reflections first, but I feel like we could just actually skip this because this last panel gave some great, great wrap-up thoughts. But Ben.
Sure. Well, I'll just offer a couple observations. Certainly on the state housing policy side, just to go back to where we started at the beginning of the day. Great treat to have our housing chairs from both the Assembly and the Senate here to offer up their reflections. And I thought we heard Assemblymember Chu say very nicely, look, 2019 was a mixed bag, some real successes, like really significant successes, but not everything we had hoped for. But 2020 for him certainly offered a lot of hope. He referred to it as a year of getting housing production done in particular. And I think what was the through line from 19 to 20, what we heard from Senator Wiener as well, was this idea that what we had done, for example, with the rent cap work, offered us a very strong foundation to build from. That one of the big critiques around zoning reform had been, well, what happens to the tenants that are in those neighborhoods, which now may be seeing a lot of development? Well, with these rent caps now in place, I think there's a lot more confidence that we can tackle zoning without quite so much fear of displacement, and that we can build on some of those alliances and partnerships of 2019 in those same conversations in 20. One of the items that I thought was very interesting was this question of sweeteners, and is that enough? Can you go back in 20 with big zoning reform and not have something to put on the table? And I think the initial, Assemblymember Chu very quickly said, no, we don't need any sweeteners. But as the conversation evolved, it's clear there are a couple of things that could be brought forward. And one of those certainly could be, and perhaps should be, something around tax increment financing and redevelopment. So that would be a very powerful tool. We saw a bill go all the way through both chambers this year from Senator Bell that was ultimately vetoed by the governor, but with a veto message that still left open the door for a conversation in 2020 to do it differently. And I could sort of, as they were talking, imagine sort of a little beginnings perhaps of a bundle or a 2020 package that might include both tax increment financing, impact fee reform as well, and zoning reform, really helping, particularly with those cities that are struggling with capacity issues. They need the impact fee money. They need the TIF dollars to be able to invest in capacity on planning side. But putting those together might really help get it all done. And then, this idea also that if you are putting money out there with strings attached, you got to go huge. You've got to have it big enough that it'll really motivate the smaller cities to actually change behaviors and incentives. And then last, I think a lot of the rap has been, 2020 is an election year. Are we really gonna, can real change actually ever happen in an election year in California? And boy, those two committee chairs really went out strong on that point with a lot of optimism. And I think, the perspective there could be that, yes, election years are often hard, but maybe this is an election year when the thing that is motivating people in their campaigns is housing. And so this could be a way for many of these members of the legislature to actually have something to campaign on by actually getting something done big on housing. I think that's the hopeful take that we heard from them this morning, and it's pretty exciting.
Great. So I think it's my job to actually talk about political process and coalition building as takeaways and insights from today, which we definitely got a number of. But I just have to say my biggest takeaway, kind of as an aside, is that we need to go bold on CEQA reform. When I heard from every single one of the communities who have actually had a major impact around zoning, you've got to start with that kind of approvals process challenge and planning in advance, so to speak, and then having something that looks a lot more like by right in a lot more places that go along with these activities. So I have to say that's not really coalition building necessarily, but to that point or related to that point on the coalition building and the political process, I think some of the big takeaways that I heard is how we talk about zoning reform and how we message to everyone this whole issue of exclusionary zoning and bringing this back for real in our language, but also in our coalition building and in the intended results of these reforms really has to be about overcoming the, immoral zoning that we have in most places in this country and the racist zoning that we have. And I think that argument is a really powerful one, and we have to message around that more clarity. So that goes to the point of, keeping it simple. I think there is a way of keeping it simple and direct from a messaging standpoint that will be helpful. And related to that, I kept hearing from many of the panelists this idea of we need more housing choices. We need more choices in the typologies. We need more choices in the size. And again, I think that all goes along with the messaging that could have an impact on the legislators who have to take, hard votes to, deal with some of these challenging issues. The last thing I would say, just to take it one more step on comprehensiveness from a political coalition building standpoint, I heard a number of suggestions today that I think we really haven't done well in California, which is to marry some of these reforms that we're talking about in terms of density and zoning reform with very concrete financial incentives, with very concrete programmatic responses, particularly around housing affordability and around gentrification. One thing that didn't come up, but is as an example, Portland has a very specific home ownership program that reaches out to and gives priority to people who have been displaced from formerly redlined neighborhoods. And, just making sure that as we do the zoning reform, we think about what are the incentives for home ownership, for example, for people who might be displaced from any of these communities, and just tying our programmatic response, whether it's LIHTC policy or home ownership policy, to directly some of these reforms that we're making, I think, again, will feed well into the message and hopefully the coalition building that will help these things get through.
I'm here to talk about sort of the research side and what we know and what we don't know. I want to thank all of our speakers. It was a really fascinating conversation to hear about your experiences. And it made me reflect on the fact that there has been such a fundamental shift in the conversation around both affordability and residential segregation that it's not just about subsidized housing anymore. It's about really making sure that our market housing is meeting the needs of all families at all affordability levels and in all places, and that sort of diversity of choice. And that's not a conversation that we've had until recently, and it's not an area of research that has been very robust until recently. And I think when I think about it, our data and our research have not caught up with these questions of what is the best way to do zoning reform. And I think when we started to do our work on SB 50, I was like, oh, well, yeah, there's parcel level data that has the zoning codes, that has R1, R2, commercial 1, commercial 2. And then somebody much smarter than me said, yeah, but what does R1 mean? And I said, well, what do you mean, what does R1 mean? It means residential. And they're like, well, what are the setbacks? What are the view lines? What are the density restrictions? What are this? What is this? What is this? And so we dug in, and to the simplicity, right, it's 300 pages to figure out what an R1 is, and we don't have that data. So it's very hard to know what happens when you lift one of those restrictions or two of those restrictions. How much more supply are you actually going to get? I think the other big question for me, and this is a failing of economic analysis more generally, is that we tend to focus on markets and we don't focus as much on neighborhoods within markets. And so these questions of equity and these questions of which neighborhoods are going to bear the brunt of any of our policies and which are going to benefit, we really don't have great answers to that. And so I think my reflections are, one, this idea of local market context and really understanding the distinction about places is really important as we move forward. And it's important on everything of how much do we densify. And I heard very much from our other speakers that they are taking a subtler approach to density in some neighborhoods, right? Like thinking about it's not just one big stick everywhere where everything looks the same. I think the other thing that we really need to understand better is inclusionary and how much value capture can we get and how much do we do in a way that incentivizes market production but also doesn't disincentivize sort of the affordability component that we could get. finding that balance is really hard, and setting that too high is going to make it so that we can't build anywhere, and setting it too low is going to leave really important affordable housing stock on the table. So finding that balance. And then lastly, well, there's two other things that I was thinking about as I was hearing. One is unintended consequences, and making sure that we're using this moment of all these changes to really study what happens. And I think Elizabeth Kneebone said it well, that we need to be able to iterate and change and respond as we learn more about what these policies do. And then finally, and this is just a personal struggle I'm having, this idea of sort of gentle density, right? And then I think the challenge that Senator Wiener said at the very beginning, this crisis, both the affordability crisis and the climate crisis, are so intense. Is it really the time to go bold, right? Is incremental or gentle density just not enough to get the things that we want? So I'll leave it there.
Great. Well, thank you for your reflections. And in a moment, we're going to ask all of you to get your lunch and come back and sit at a table. And we'd really like to continue this conversation because we're still absorbing the information. I think you all still probably have ideas that you want to contribute to how we ought to be thinking about moving forward on these issues in California. And we want to have that rich conversation over lunch. We are going to stop the live stream when we break for lunch and just come back and have that as a more informal conversations, because it's a little hard to have a tabletop conversation with a live stream audience. So, but we certainly encourage anybody who is listening to feel free to send us any of your thoughts and reflections on these issues, because we will be, again, summarizing the ideas that come out of this convening. So before we break for lunch and then come back, I do just again want to thank all of our speakers who have contributed so many great ideas to the day. I want to thank again the Terner team, and I neglected to mention this morning Max Henninger, who is a graduate student researcher who really put together that matrix, by the way, which I thought was very useful, of all the different zoning reforms we've seen in a variety of places, but also all the students, graduate students who have been helping out here throughout the day and hopefully learning something along the way. So thank you all, and let's take a quick break for lunch, 10 minutes. Come back and we'll start, table conversations, and we will have people from the Terner Center at each table try to consolidate tables. We will have people at each table taking notes and facilitating the conversation. And thank you all again. Go ahead.
I was thinking that maybe we could also encourage all the panelists to split across the tables, and so that we can all benefit more from your insights, because I think there's a lot of us here who want to figure out what you've learned and how we can learn from you. So,
great. Thank you all very much.